Erisen Vale learned early that hedges had moods. Not the tame, clipped kind that ringed a kitchen garden, but the old border growth that rose like walls along the marches of Valethorn, bristling corridors of briar and hawthorn that shifted when no one watched. In one village, the elders swore the living green listened for lies. In another, they left bowls of spring water at the roots so the thorns would not creep closer at night. Erisen did not argue with elders. She simply kept her hood up, her coin string tied close, and her songs carefully ordinary. The road that morning was narrow, packed hard by wagon ruts and winter rain. On either side, thorn hedges leaned in, their pale barbs catching the weak sun. The air smelled of wet leaf mold and iron. Far off, crows called like warning bells. A cart ahead of her jolted over a stone, and a sack slipped loose. Turnips scattered, rolling into the ditch. The farmer cursed, jumped down, and swatted at the hedge as if it had tripped him on purpose. The thorns twitched. Erisen felt it like the prickle of hair rising on her arms. The hedge was not moving the way wind moved it. It tightened. It leaned. A barb angled toward the farmer's forearm like a needle seeking skin. Easy, she breathed under her scarf, though the hedge would not hear that word. Not the way it needed. The farmer scooped turnips with frantic hands. One rolled beneath the hedge's lower branches. He reached after it. Erisen stopped walking. Her gift sat behind her ribs like a second heartbeat, quiet until it wasn't. She could have let the hedge take him. Most travelers did. Most travelers pretended hedges were just plants and pain was always someone else's bargain. But she had seen what barbs did to flesh. She had seen infected scratches become fever and fever become funerals. Erisen lifted her chin as if stretching a stiff neck and hummed a single note so soft it barely disturbed the air. Not a ballad, not a melody anyone could follow. A tone shaped to soothe a living lattice of sap and thorn. The sound slid out of her like warmth. The hedge paused. Its barbs eased, the way a clenched fist might open when it realized it was holding nothing but fear. The farmer's fingers closed around the turnip. He pulled it free, glanced up once as if he'd sensed something, and then, with the stubborn blindness of the ungifted, went back to cursing the mud. Erisen let the note die. Her mouth tasted faintly of copper, as it always did when she used too much breath on the wrong kind of silence. She walked on before anyone could look at her too closely. By noon, the road widened into a market town that clung to the edge of the Briarholt lands. Its name was pinned to a weathered sign, Wickarrow, and the letters had been scratched and re-scratched as if even words did not hold still out here. Wickarrow's square was a knot of stalls and voices. Smoke from cookfires hung low beneath a sky the color of old wool. Geese hissed in a pen. Children darted between barrels. Traders shouted prices that sounded like challenges. In the center, a low stone well had a wreath of dried herbs tied to its handle, an old habit against bad luck. Erisen found the least noticed spot she could near a cracked pillar by the well where the stone gave her back something solid to lean on. She unwrapped her scarf, smoothed the travel dust from her sleeves, and loosened the clasp of her small lute. Ordinary songs first. Always ordinary. She began with a simple tune about a fisherman who fell in love with the moon. Nothing true, nothing sharp. Her voice was clear enough to draw a few glances. A woman buying onions paused to listen. A boy with a loaf under his arm slowed his steps. A pair of soldiers, town watch, by their patched coats, leaned against a post and smirked. Erisen kept her gaze down. Smiles invited questions. Questions invited attention. Attention invited cages. She played through the first song and into the second, letting the notes thread through the square like ribbon. Coins began to clink into her cap. Not many, but enough for bread and a pallet by a hearth. Then a commotion on the edge of the market tugged at the crowd's attention. A mule spooked at a sudden shout and lurched sideways, snapping its lead rope. The cart it pulled swung wide, wheels scraping stone. A stack of woven baskets toppled. People scattered with cries. The mule's hoof struck the low hedge bordering the square, a decorative strip of thorny green that was meant to keep carts from cutting across the grass. The hedge shuddered like an insulted animal. Its barbs lifted, bristling. A little girl, hair in two uneven braids, had been crouching near the hedge, chasing a runaway apple. The apple rolled against the roots. The girl reached. No, her mother cried, too far away. Erisen's fingers stumbled on the lute strings. Her breath hitched. In that instant she could have held her ordinary song and prayed. She could have stayed invisible and let the hedge decide. Instead, the old, stubborn part of her, soft and furious, made a choice. Her voice slipped into a different register, quiet but precise, threaded with the resonance that was never meant for open air. She sang one phrase, not words, not any language the crowd would recognize. A cadence shaped like a gentle hand. The hedge softened as if it exhaled. The barbs sank. The green branches eased back from the girl's sleeve by the width of a heartbeat. The child snatched up the apple, blinked, and toddled backward into her mother's arms. The market's noise resumed in a rush, as if the world had only paused to take a breath. The mule was caught and soothed. The toppled baskets were righted. The moment became a story people would tell later, changing its shape with each telling. Erisen sat very still, her pulse loud in her ears. She had been careful. Too careful, perhaps. But kindness had a way of ruining caution. A man at the well stared at the hedge as if it had betrayed him. Another narrowed his eyes at Erisen, then at the hedge, as if connecting invisible threads. One of the watchmen straightened from his post and nudged his companion. Erisen forced her hands to steady on the lute. She played the next chord as if nothing had happened. She sang a third song, bright and harmless, and tried to keep her voice from trembling. But the air had changed. Eyes lingered longer. Whispers traveled. By the time her cap held enough coin to justify leaving, Erisen's skin felt too tight. She gathered her things quickly. She did not look at anyone as she stepped away from the well. She aimed for the narrow lane that led toward the inn-quarter, keeping to the shadow of a timbered eave. She made it 3 streets before the feeling arrived, heavy and certain, as if the world had turned its face toward her. Footsteps behind, measured. Erisen did not run. Running made men chase. She kept walking, heart pounding, and turned into a side alley lined with stacked crates. The smell of old cider and damp straw rose around her. The footsteps followed. A hand closed on her upper arm. Firm. Not cruel. Not gentle, either. Mistress Vale, a man said close to her ear. She froze at the sound of her name. Most people did not know it. She used different ones in different towns. The road taught that trick as well. She twisted her head just enough to see him. He was not town watch. His coat was dark wool, cleanly mended, and the clasp at his throat bore an emblem, 2 crossed briars worked in dull metal. His eyes were a flat, steady brown. How, she began, and then bit the word off. It did not matter how. It only mattered that someone had traced her. Come, he said. You are needed. I'm needed in plenty of places, she replied, keeping her voice calm. Calm made doors open sometimes. I can be paid for a performance. I can't be taken. His grip did not tighten, but it did not loosen. You will come without trouble. Or what? She asked softly. The man's gaze flicked once to the hedge above the alley wall, where thorny branches leaned in like eavesdroppers. Or you will be made to. Erisen's mouth went dry. She could sing to thorn-hedges. She could not sing to men with knives. She turned her face fully to him, forcing herself to meet his eyes. Who sent you? Briarholt, he said. The word landed like the toll of a bell. Everyone on the marches knew the name. The Hedge-Maze Lord. The keep wrapped in green. The Varricant's master, if any mortal could claim mastery over a labyrinth that 8 roads. I did nothing wrong, she said. No, the man agreed, and there was something like reluctant respect in the way he said it. That is why you are worth taking. Before she could speak again, the alley mouth filled with another figure, larger, blocking the light. A second man, this one with a scar along his jaw and a plain baton at his belt. He did not smile. Erisen's mind raced. If she screamed, would anyone come? The market was a few streets away. The alley was narrow. The men looked like they had done this before. Her gift stirred behind her ribs. There were thorny vines on the wall. There were roots under the stones. There was green everywhere if you knew how to listen. She could sing. And be heard. And be remembered. Nobles did not forget keys. "I'll walk," she said, and hated the tremor in her own words. "But you'll take your hand off me." The first man studied her for a breath. Then he released her arm, stepping back half a pace. "Good." Erisen adjusted her cloak, masking the shake in her fingers. She kept her lute close to her body like a shield. They led her not to the town gate but to the rear yards where carts were stored. A covered wagon waited there, its wheels cleaned, its harnesses oiled. 2 horses stood ready, their ears flicking, calm as if this were a normal errand. Erisen climbed into the wagon without being shoved. That small mercy made the situation feel worse. It meant they did not need force. It meant they were confident. The canvas flap fell, cutting her off from the light. The air inside smelled of wool and dried herbs, hedgewarden's scents. The floorboards vibrated as the horses started forward. She pressed her palm to the wood, feeling each jolt, each turn. She tried to count streets. She tried to guess direction. The wagon moved too smoothly, taking back lanes that didn't match the town's layout. They were leaving Wickarrow. Her throat tightened around a bitter laugh that never made it out. She had spent years staying one step ahead of hungry hands. All it took was one act of kindness and a single hedge in a market square. Hours passed in a blur of motion and muffled voices outside. Twice the wagon stopped. She heard the scrape of boots, the low murmur of men speaking in clipped phrases. Once, a guard lifted the flap just enough to slide a waterskin inside. "Drink," he said. Not unkind. Not kind, either. Erisen drank because thirst would not help her think. Toward evening, the air changed. Cool dampness seeped through the canvas. The wagon's wheels began to crunch over something that was not roadstone, gravel mixed with leaf litter. The horses' breaths steamed in the chill. Then came the scent, green, sharp, wild. Thorn. The wagon slowed. It turned. The floor tilted slightly, as if the path beneath them curved in a way that shouldn't exist. Erisen held her breath, listening. Beyond the canvas, there was no market noise, no distant barking, no human clutter. There was only wind through branches, and beneath it, a faint creak, like wood shifting under strain. The canvas flap was pulled back. Dusk flooded in, grey and cold. A tall iron gate stood ahead, flanked by stone pillars half swallowed by living briar. The hedge around it was not decorative. It was a wall of barbed growth as thick as a cottage, its branches woven tight, its thorns pale as bone. Briarholt. Erisen's stomach turned, not with fear alone, but with recognition. The hedges here felt different, alert, restless, threaded with a tension she could taste on her tongue. As the wagon rolled through the gate, she saw bandages on a man's hands as he hauled the iron open. She saw a woman carrying a basket of salves, her face drawn. She saw a courtyard where the stones were cracked by roots forcing their way up. And beyond the keep's outer wall, rising like a second fortress made of green and shadow, the Varricant Maze stretched, thorn corridors folding into themselves, high and breathing, as if the land had grown a living wound. Erisen swallowed hard. A man approached the wagon, his posture straight with the stiffness of duty. He wore a captain's mantle over practical leather, and a short sword at his hip. His hair was cropped close, his expression guarded. "Out," he said, not harshly. "You'll come with me." Erisen climbed down, her boots landing on damp stone. Cold seeped through the soles into her bones. She expected to be marched to a dungeon. Instead, she was escorted across the courtyard to an inner hall where lamps burned behind horn panes. The air inside smelled of smoke and wet wool and something else, sap, bruised leaves, the raw scent of cut hedge. Servants moved quietly, eyes lowered. No one spoke above a murmur, as if loud voices might wake something sleeping. They brought her to a chamber not luxurious but clean, a narrow bed with a thick blanket, a washbasin with warm water, and a small window barred not with iron but with thorn vine woven around the frame like decoration that was not decoration at all. The captain stood in the doorway. "Wait here. Am I a guest?" Erisen asked, trying to keep sarcasm from her voice. He looked at her as if weighing whether she deserved the truth. "You are not in irons. Do not give anyone cause to change that." He left, closing the door. Erisen sat on the bed and stared at her hands. They were steady now only because she refused to let them shake. She pressed her fingers together, feeling calluses from lute strings. Feeling the faint ache in her chest where her gift lived. If she sang here, the hedges would hear. The maze would hear. And if the wrong people heard, she would become a tool locked behind Briarholt's gates. She stood and crossed to the window. Outside, thorn walls hemmed in the keep like watchful giants. Somewhere beyond them, the maze shifted with a sigh that sounded too much like hunger. A knock came. The door opened without waiting for permission. He stepped in like a storm contained in a man. Lord Soren Crowthorne was taller than she expected, lean in the way of someone who carried burdens more than feasts. His dark hair fell untidily across his brow as if he had run his hands through it too often. His coat was well made but worn at the cuffs, and a smear of dried sap marked one sleeve. His eyes were the color of late autumn earth, steady, deep, and tired in a way no sleep could fix. He did not bow. Erisen did not curtsy. For a moment they simply looked at each other, two strangers bound by a thing neither of them had wanted in the open. "You are Erisen Vale," he said. "I am," she replied. "And you are the man who thinks he can take me." A muscle jumped in his jaw. "I can." Honesty, then. No softening. No pretend courtesy. She almost preferred it to false charm. "Why?" she asked. "If you wanted a singer, you could have hired one." "I don't need a tavern tune," he said, voice low. "I need what you did in Wickarrow." Erisen's heart kicked hard. She kept her face blank. "I don't know what you mean." His gaze did not waver. "You calmed a thorn hedge with your voice. People say many things when they're frightened." "People are frightened here," he said, and for the first time something cracked through his iron control. Not anger. Not arrogance. Fear. He moved closer, stopping just short of her personal space, as if he understood that stepping 1 inch further might be the difference between cooperation and war. "My hedge wardens are disappearing," he said. "Not on the roads. Not in the outer growth. In the maze itself. Men and women who know every ritual my house has used for generations. The Varricant is shifting in daylight. It's striking without warning. It's taking heat from people's bodies like a leech takes blood." Erisen's throat tightened. The tension she'd tasted on the air outside Briarholt suddenly had shape. Soren's voice hardened again, as if he could not bear to show more than a sliver of desperation. "If you can open pathways, if you can calm the hedges, then you will do so here." Erisen took a slow breath. The room felt smaller, the window's thorn vine framing the darkening sky like a cage. "You didn't bring me to ask," she said softly. "No," he replied. "And if I refuse?" His eyes flicked to the door, where guards waited beyond. "Then people will keep dying." The words were an accusation without being one. A weight placed carefully on her shoulders, as if he'd learned the balance of guilt like a weapon. Erisen's hands curled around the strap of her lute. She could hear her own pulse. She could hear, faintly, beyond stone and glass and woven thorn, the restless creak of living green. She had spent her life running from nobles who wanted to own her gift. She had sworn she would never sing on command. But she had also sworn, silently, to herself that if she ever had the power to keep someone from bleeding out in a ditch, she would not look away. "I will not be your instrument," she said, each word shaped like a boundary. "I will not be locked in a tower and dragged out when you decide to use me. I will not be threatened. And I will not have my gift turned into a leash." Soren stared at her as if no one had spoken to him like that in years. "What do you want?" he asked, and his voice was clipped, careful, like a man negotiating with a blade. "I want choice," Erisen said. "I will help because I decide to. I will walk your grounds without being followed into every corner. I will be fed and housed as a person, not a thing. And when your people are safe, when the maze stops eating them, I leave." Silence stretched. Erisen forced herself not to fill it. At last, Soren exhaled, slow through his nose, as if releasing a grip on something sharp. "You will be watched in the maze," he said. "You won't wander it alone. That's not a threat. That's reality." "I'm not foolish," Erisen said. He nodded once, almost imperceptible. "Matron Liska Fen will see to your needs. Captain Odrin Pell will escort you." You will not be harmed by my household. And by you? She asked before she could stop herself. A flicker crossed his face, something like offense, then something like resignation. By me, he said, you will be used only as much as necessary to keep my people alive. Erisen's stomach clenched. He still spoke like a man accustomed to taking. But beneath it was that desperate fear again, and a kind of grim honor in admitting what he was. I'll go into the maze once, she said. Tomorrow. I will see what you're dealing with. Then I'll decide whether my gift can help without killing me. Soren's gaze sharpened. It won't wait. It will, Erisen said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her tone. If it wants me to sing, it can wait until my breath isn't shaking. Another silence. Then, slowly, Soren inclined his head. Not a bow. Not a concession he'd ever want his enemies to see. Tomorrow at first light, he said. Rest while you can. He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. You hide your gift because you think nobles will use you, he said, without looking back. Erisen's fingers tightened on her lute strap. Soren's voice dropped, rougher. You're right. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality. Erisen stood alone in the small room, staring at the thorn-woven window as darkness thickened outside. Somewhere in the distance, the maze shifted again, a long, hungry sound like a sigh turning into a bite. She sat on the bed and laid her hand against her throat. Tomorrow, she would sing to something that could swallow men whole. And she could not decide which frightened her more, the living labyrinth, or the Lord who had begged for her help without ever learning how to ask. Morning came thin and colorless, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over Briarholt. Erisen woke before the knock, already tense, as though her body had spent the night listening. The keep was quieter than any inn she'd ever slept in. No laughter, no casual shouting from cooks, no sleepy arguments over chores. Only the occasional creak of timber and the faintest scratch sound outside her window, thornvine rubbing against stone like a restless finger. When the knock came, it was measured. Matron Liska Fen entered carrying a folded bundle. She was broad-shouldered and sturdy in a way that made Erisen think of oak trunks and winter hearths. Her grey hair was pinned in a tight coil, and her face had the lined calm of someone who had endured crises without theatrics. I'm not here to frighten you, Liska said, setting the bundle on the bed. That's the men's work, apparently. Erisen blinked, thrown by the dry humor. Liska's eyes warmed slightly. Captain Pell will be at the inner gate in 15 minutes. Eat something first. She gestured toward a tray on the small table, bread, a wedge of cheese, and a cup of broth that still steamed. Erisen's stomach tightened at the thought of food, but she forced herself to take a bite. The bread was dense and good. The broth tasted of herbs and salt and the kind of care no one bothered to notice until it was missing. Liska unfolded the bundle. Inside was a cloak of thick green wool and a pair of leather gloves, their palms reinforced with stitched hide. Wear these, Liska said. Thorns don't care how brave you are. Erisen slid the gloves on. They were slightly too large, but that was better than too small. She pulled on the cloak and felt its weight settle over her shoulders like a promise of warmth. Liska watched her with a steady expression. You can still try to run, she said, matter of fact. Some have. Before you. Not with singing, mind. Other solutions. Erisen's gaze sharpened. And Liska's mouth tightened. The maze doesn't like chasing. It likes catching. The words were not meant to scare her. They were meant to make her honest. Erisen set her cup down carefully. Does Lord Crowthorne always take what he wants? Liska's eyes flicked to the door as if checking for listening ears. He takes what he thinks he must, she corrected. There's a difference. It's not a comforting one. But it exists. Does he ever ask? Erisen said. Liska considered. Not well. Erisen almost laughed, but the sound would have broken in her throat. Then why are you helping me? Liska's gaze didn't waver. Because if you can do what they say you can, you might keep my people alive. Her voice softened by a fraction. And because I'm tired of watching fear be mistaken for strength. Erisen swallowed, feeling that land in her chest. Liska gestured her toward the door. Come. before the hedge wardens get impatient and start doing foolish things to prove they aren't afraid. They walked together through corridors that smelled of smoke and damp stone. Servants moved aside quickly, heads lowered, eyes darting to Erisen and away again. She caught whispers, nothing clear, only breath and superstition. The Thornsinger. The captive. The key. At the inner gate, Captain Odrin Pell waited with 6 hedge wardens. He was built like a man used to carrying heavy things, broad, solid, practical. He wore leather layered over wool, with a short blade and a hooked pruning sickle at his belt. His men and women carried lanterns and satchels of tools. Their hands were wrapped in old bandages, their knuckles bore scars that spoke of countless small wounds. Odrin looked Erisen up and down, not leering, not dismissive, assessing. "You're smaller than the rumors," he said. Erisen lifted her chin. "Rumors have a habit of growing." One corner of his mouth twitched as if he approved. "You know what you're walking into." "The maze," she said. "The maze," he echoed, as if the word should be spoken with reverence. "Stay between me and the lantern-bearer. Don't touch the walls. Don't sing unless you must." Erisen's fingers tightened around the strap of her lute case. "If I must, you'll know." Odrin said. "That's what worries me." Behind him, a younger hedge warden shifted, too eager, too tense. He had a narrow face and dark hair that stuck up in stubborn tufts. A charm of knotted twine hung around his wrist. His eyes flicked to Erisen with an expression that was part hope, part resentment. Odrin followed her gaze. "That's Nem," he said. "Nema Ashk. He's seen too many disappear." Nem stepped forward before Odrin could stop him. "If you can do it," he blurted, voice tight, "why'd you wait until now? Why'd you hide?" Erisen held his stare. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and the skin beneath them looked bruised with fear. "Because people don't like gifts they can't own," she said quietly. "And because some of us have learned the price of being found." Nem's jaw clenched. He looked as if he wanted to argue, but Odrin laid a firm hand on his shoulder. "Not now," Odrin said. Nem swallowed his words. The hand on his shoulder did not soften, but it steadied him. They moved out into the courtyard and toward the hedge wall that marked the maze's boundary. Up close, the Varricant was not just a tangle of briar. It rose as high as the keep's towers, layered upon itself in thick braided growth. Its thorns were pale and long, glinting like bone needles. Between branches, pockets of shadow shifted, as if corridors were rearranging themselves behind a curtain of leaves. Erisen felt her gift stir, uneasy, as if it recognized a thing that spoke the same language but with a deeper throat. Odrin stopped before an iron arch set into the hedge. The arch was old, its metal dark with age. Around it, the thorn growth had been trained to hold its shape. There were carvings in the iron, symbols that looked like curling vines and closed circles. Erisen leaned closer. The air near the arch tasted like sap and rust and something faintly sweet, like bruised blossoms. Odrin lifted a lantern and looked at the symbols. "We used to have a ritual," he said. "Words. Offerings. Lord Crowthorne's father kept it. But then," he shrugged as if shrugging could cover grief. "Then things changed. We went to axes and fire. It worked. For a time." The hedge creaked, and Erisen felt the hair on her arms rise beneath her cloak. "Open it," Odrin said, and his voice was not command so much as plea wrapped in soldier's tone. Erisen drew a slow breath. She could sing a tone that would loosen the growth the way she had loosened the market hedge. She could soothe it just enough to part. But this was not a roadside strip of thorn. This was a living fortress. She unfastened the lute case and held it close, more comfort than tool. Then she tipped her head toward the arch and sang a single low note. The sound threaded into the iron and into the green, humming through leaf veins and root memory. The hedge shivered. Thorns eased away from the arch as if making room for a guest it did not yet trust. A seam appeared, a narrow opening, black beyond. Odrin exhaled. "That's it," he murmured, and it sounded like a man who had been holding his breath for weeks. They stepped through. Inside, the world changed. The light dimmed immediately, swallowed by leaves. The air was cooler, damp with a constant hush. The ground beneath their boots was not soil but a woven mat of roots and fallen leaves packed hard. Their lanterns threw small circles of gold that barely reached the hedge walls, which rose on either side like living cliffs. The maze smelled alive in a way the outside hedges did not. Not only plant and earth, but something almost animal, warm sap, sweet rot, and a faint metallic tang that prickled at the back of Erisen's throat. The corridor ahead was straight for 20 paces, then bent sharply left. The hedge walls leaned inward slightly, as if listening. Nem made a small sound in his throat. "It's quieter," he whispered. Odrin shot him a look. "Don't talk," he said. "The maze likes to know you're here." Erisen frowned. "It hears voices." Odrin's eyes stayed on the corridor ahead. "It hears everything." Erisen's gift hummed under her ribs, responding to the hedge's tension like a tuning fork. They walked. At first, the corridor remained stable. The hedge walls rustled faintly, but no thorns struck. Erisen breathed slowly, matching her steps to her heartbeat, trying to feel the maze the way she felt a wild animal, by its pauses, its attention, its subtle shifts. Then, without warning, the corridor narrowed. It wasn't a slam of growth. It was a quiet, steady creep, branches leaning in inch by inch. The lantern light caught thorns that hadn't been there moments before. Odrin held up a hand. Everyone stopped at once, disciplined. The hedge walls continued their slow narrowing like jaws closing with patience. Erisen's pulse spiked. This wasn't anger. It was need. The maze's presence pressed against her like hunger in a room, the way a starving person watches bread. She swallowed and sang again, soft, controlled, a tone shaped like reassurance. The hedge hesitated. The narrowing stopped. For a heartbeat, the walls seemed to breathe outward as if relieved. Then the corridor ahead twisted. Not shifted. Twisted. The straight line of roots underfoot became a curve, then another, as if the ground itself had been unrolled and re-rolled. The bend that should have led left now led into a dark pocket of shadow that hadn't existed. Nem swore under his breath. Odrin's hand tightened on his lantern. That wasn't there. Erisen's stomach sank. "It's moving." "It always moves," Odrin said, voice rough. "But not like this. Not while we're watching." Erisen forced herself to focus beyond fear. The hedge walls weren't bristling. They were trembling, faintly, like a body shivering. The air felt colder the farther the corridor bent away from where it should have gone. "Where are we supposed to go?" she asked. Odrin lifted his chin toward a mark carved into the hedge on the right, an old notch filled with dark resin. "There's a pruning cache down the third fork," he said. "We left tools. And a map." His mouth tightened. "If it's still there." Erisen stepped forward carefully. Her boots pressed into root mat with a soft give. She sang a low, steady hum, not enough to force the maze, but enough to keep connection. The sound slipped into the green like a thread into cloth. The corridor loosened a fraction, as if the maze acknowledged her presence. They moved again. At the first fork, the left passage looked familiar, wider, with older scarring on the hedge walls where pruning hooks had cut. The right passage looked newer, the leaves glossy, the thorns pale and sharp as fresh bone. Odrin started left. The hedge wall on the left twitched, barbs lifting. Not striking, but warning. Erisen stopped him with a hand on his sleeve before she could think better of it. Her touch felt shockingly intimate in that dim corridor, as if she'd reached into the guarded space between them. Odrin glanced at her hand, then at her face. Erisen pulled back immediately, cheeks warming. "It doesn't want us that way," she murmured. Nem's eyes flashed. "It never wants us anywhere," he hissed. Erisen met his gaze. "It warned us," she said. "It could have attacked." Nem's mouth twisted. "It's playing with us. Or it's asking," Erisen said, the words tasting strange and dangerous. Odrin held still, his skepticism warring with his survival instinct. "What are you saying?" he asked. Erisen pressed her gloved palm to the hedge wall on the right. The thorns did not strike. They seemed to lean toward her glove, stopping just short, as if scenting. Her gift pulsed. Not a command. A question. She hummed again, gentle. "Show me," she breathed. The right passage opened slightly, leaves easing aside, revealing a clearer corridor. It was still dark and unfamiliar, but it felt less tight, less hostile. Odrin's jaw worked. "We go right," he said, the words heavy with the weight of abandoning habit. Nem looked like he wanted to argue, but he swallowed it and moved with the others. They followed the new corridor. The farther they went, the more Erisen noticed the cold, thin feeling in the air, like the warmth was being siphoned away. Her fingers, even inside gloves, began to ache with chill. A hedge warden behind her, an older woman with a crooked nose and grey braid, coughed softly. "It's taking heat again," she whispered. Odrin nodded grimly. "Keep moving." Erisen's breath fogged. She felt as if the maze was drinking from her lungs with every inhale. Hunger, she thought. It isn't just angry. It's starving. The corridor ended abruptly at a small clearing where the hedge walls formed a rough circle. In the center stood a stump, an old, wide base of something that had once been a tree and now was carved with spiraling grooves. Around the stump lay remnants, a rusted pruning hook, a broken lantern frame, a scrap of cloth caught on a thorn like a flag. Odrin's shoulders sagged. "This was our cache." Nem stepped toward the stump. His gaze snagged on the cloth. He reached out. "Don't," Erisen said sharply. Nem froze, hand hovering. Erisen moved closer, her heart thudding. The cloth was a sleeve. It had been torn cleanly, as if ripped by force. The fabric was stiff with dried sap and dark stains. A sound rose from the hedge walls. Not a rustle. Not wind. A low creak, like a door opening in a house that hadn't been touched in years. The circle of hedge tightened. Odrin's voice snapped into command. "Back. Back now." The hedge wardens retreated a step. Erisen's pulse hammered. The maze leaned inward, thorns angling. Not in a sudden strike, but with a slow, inexorable patience. It was closing the circle. Erisen's gift flared, urgent. She sang, stronger this time, a tone that pressed outward, insisting on space. The sound vibrated in her teeth. The hedge shuddered. For a heartbeat, it hesitated. Then the thorns surged, as if offended by being denied. A barb shot forward, slicing the air where Odrin's lantern had been. Another snapped toward Nem's shoulder. Odrin yanked Nem back. The barb grazed Nem's sleeve, cutting cloth. Nem stumbled, eyes wide. The hedge wardens raised their tools instinctively, but Odrin barked, "No cutting." "Not unless I say." Erisen's throat tightened. The maze wasn't lashing like a predator. It was lashing like something desperate being kept from what it wanted. Heat. Warmth. Kindness, a part of her whispered, and the thought felt foolish even as it rang true. She stopped singing the forcing note. She shifted to a softer cadence, trembling with the risk of it. Her voice lowered. Her breath slowed. "Easy," she sang, and this time the word wasn't for people. It was for the green. The hedge paused mid-surge. Thorns hovered, vibrating with tension. Erisen took a step forward into the narrowing space, ignoring Odrin's sharp inhale. She lifted her gloved hands, palms out, not in surrender, but in offering. "I hear you," she whispered, and let her voice drop into resonance again, not a command but a lullaby shaped like comfort. The hedge quivered. The cold in the air intensified for a moment, as if the maze drew near. Erisen felt the warmth of her own body being tugged at, like a hand reaching for a blanket. Her teeth clenched against the chill. She kept singing. The hedge walls eased. Not much, but enough to stop the immediate closing. Odrin's voice was tight. "Erisen," he warned. She did not look away from the living green. "It's starving," she said between phrases, breath measured. "It's not hunting. It's hungry." Nem's voice cracked. "Hungry for what?" Erisen swallowed, feeling the tugging cold like proof. "For heat," she said. "For life." Her eyes flicked to the torn sleeve. "For what it takes." Odrin's face hardened. "Then it will keep taking. Unless we stop it." "Stop it how?" Erisen asked, and her voice had a raw edge now, not anger but the strain of holding her tone steady. "With axes. Fire. You said that used to work. And now it doesn't." Odrin's mouth tightened. He didn't answer because he didn't have one. Erisen sang the corridor open, slowly, coaxing the hedge to part. She guided the green the way one guides a frightened horse, with patience and steady breath. The circle opened enough for them to retreat. They backed out, step by step, lantern light trembling. The hedge did not strike again. It watched them go with that same pressing hunger, as if memorizing the scent of warmth. When they reached the fork again, Erisen's voice finally failed. She stopped singing and sucked in air, her throat burning. The copper taste was stronger now, metallic and bitter. Her hands shook. Oedran slowed, then glanced back at her. "You all right?" Erisen forced a nod. "I can keep going," she lied. Oedran's eyes narrowed. That wasn't the question. Erisen looked away. Admitting weakness inside a living labyrinth felt like inviting it to bite. Nem walked too close behind her, breathing hard. "If it's starving," he whispered, and there was a different emotion in his voice now, something like fear layered over anger. "Then what do we do?" "Feed it." Oedran barked a humorless laugh. "With what?" "Bread." Erisen's mind churned. Feeding a hedge wasn't like feeding a dog. But the maze was not just hedge. It was old, vast, and bound to something deeper than leaves and thorns. She remembered the symbols on the iron arch. The spirals. The closed circles. Not mere decoration. Maybe it was meant to be fed, she said softly, more to herself than them. Not with flesh. With stewardship. Oedran's gaze sharpened. "That's law talk." "Law is just memory people stopped believing," Erisen replied. They reached the entrance arch again, and Erisen sang the seam open once more. The hedge parted reluctantly, as if leaving the warmth of their bodies behind. Outside, the air felt almost warm by comparison. Erisen staggered one step, legs weak. Oedran caught her elbow. His grip was steady, careful not to bruise. The touch sent an unexpected heat through her, simple human steadiness, not possession. Erisen's breath hitched. Oedran released her quickly, as if he'd realized too late that she wasn't used to being held without threat. "Sorry," he muttered. "It's fine," she said, but her voice came out rough. They crossed the courtyard. The keep servants watched from doorways like ghosts. A pair of hedge wardens walked with shoulders hunched, as if the maze's cold still clung to them. In the hall, Soren Crowthorne waited. He stood near a map table, one hand braced on the edge as if he'd been leaning there for hours. His coat was fastened wrong at the throat, and there were faint smears of sap on his knuckles. When he saw Erisen, his eyes sharpened, taking in the pallor of her face, the tremor in her hands. He didn't ask if she was all right. He asked, "Did it open?" Erisen stared at him for a beat. The question was so like him, results first, feelings later. Survival demanded it, perhaps. Or habit did. "Yes," she said, voice hoarse. It opened. Soren's shoulders lowered by a fraction, relief and grim resolve tangled together. "And," he pressed. Erisen stepped closer, drawn despite herself by the intensity of his attention. "It's changing," she said. "Not just shifting. It moves while you're looking at it. It closes around you slowly. It's taking heat." Soren's jaw clenched. "We know." "No," Erisen said, and the force of it surprised her. "You know what it does. You don't know why." His gaze snapped to hers. "Tell me." Erisen swallowed, feeling her throat ache. "It's starving," she said. "Like a living thing that's been kept in hunger so long it doesn't remember any other way to exist. When I sang gently, it eased. When I pushed, it fought harder." She hesitated, then added the truth that sat like a stone. "It isn't only dangerous. It's desperate." Soren's expression tightened as if she'd insulted him. "Desperate things kill," he said. "Yes," Erisen replied, meeting his gaze. "And desperate people do, too." The words hung between them, sharp and honest. For a moment, she thought he might flare anger, dismissal, something easy. Instead, he looked tired in a way that made him seem younger and older at once. "What do you want from me?" he asked, low. Erisen's hands curled around the edge of the map table, grounding herself. The wood was worn smooth by generations of anxious fingers. "I want you to stop thinking you can beat it into obedience," she said quietly. I want you to consider that it might respond to something other than pain. Soren's eyes narrowed. Kindness. The word sounded foreign in his mouth. Erisen almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. Care, she said. Attention. Offerings. Vows. Soren's gaze flicked to the map, to the inked lines marking corridors that were probably already obsolete. My family has bound the Varricant for generations, he said. We have rituals. Rules. We have always kept it contained. And yet it's eating your people, Erisen said softly. Silence. In that silence, she could hear faint sounds from beyond the walls, a distant rustle, like the maze shifting in its sleep. Soren's hand tightened on the table edge. His knuckles whitened. Captain Odrin cleared his throat. She's right about one thing, he said, voice grudging. When she sang softer, it stopped pushing. When she pushed, it snapped. Soren's eyes flicked to Odrin, then back to Erisen. And what does it do when you don't sing at all? Erisen's stomach tightened. She pictured the torn sleeve caught on Thorn, the circle narrowing with slow patience. It takes, she said simply. Soren's face hardened again, the mask returning. Then you will sing, he said. Erisen's spine stiffened. I will sing, she corrected, as long as I'm able. But I can't be a bandage on a wound you keep reopening. Soren's gaze held hers, and for a heartbeat she saw something like conflict, pride wrestling with fear, control wrestling with the fact that control was failing. Liska Fen stepped into the hall without announcement, as if she belonged there more than the stones did. She carried a bowl of salve and a strip of cloth. Her voice is strained, Liska said, brisk. If you burn it out, you'll have nothing. And neither will we. Soren's jaw tightened. I didn't ask, no, Liska said, and there was iron under her calm. You seldom do. Erisen's lips pressed together, caught between gratitude and the dawning realization that Liska must have spoken to Soren like this before and survived. Liska gestured at Erisen's hands. Sit, she ordered. Erisen hesitated, then obeyed, lowering herself onto a bench. Liska took her gloved hands and tugged the gloves off. The skin beneath was reddened, not from thorns but from cold, and her fingers trembled with fatigue. Liska rubbed salve into her knuckles with firm, practiced motions. The herb scent rose, sharp and comforting. Erisen swallowed hard. No one had tended her hands in years. She had tended her own in lonely inns, rubbing cheap oil into cracked skin and calling it enough. Soren watched, his expression unreadable. When Liska finished, she tied the cloth around Erisen's hands loosely. No singing until you've had tea and rest, she said, then looked up at Soren. If the maze doesn't wait, then you'd better start learning how to listen without her doing all the work. Soren's eyes flashed. You speak as if I can soothe it with words. Liska's gaze was steady. You speak to everyone else often enough, she said. Try speaking without barbs. Odrin coughed, hiding what might have been a laugh. Erisen lowered her gaze to her wrapped hands, but warmth spread in her chest that had nothing to do with salve. Soren turned away abruptly, as if needing motion to keep from admitting anything. Captain Pell, he said, voice clipped. Double the wardens on the inner hedge. No pruning without my order. No fire. Odrin straightened. Yes, my lord. And, Soren added, hesitating as if the next words cost him, bring me the old records. The ones from my father's steward. The ones with the rituals. Odrin's eyebrows lifted slightly. Aye, he said, and there was something like cautious hope in it. Soren's gaze returned to Erisen. His eyes were still hard, but the desperation beneath them had shifted, less raw, more focused. You said vows, he murmured. What kind? Erisen swallowed. She thought of the iron arch symbols, the spirals like coils of promise, the closed circles like bonds. I don't know yet, she admitted, and it felt dangerous to confess ignorance to a lord. But the maze is older than your house's fear. It was made for something. If we find what it was meant to hold, we might find what it needs. Soren's stare lingered on her for a beat longer than necessary, as if he were trying to decide whether she was a threat or a lifeline. Eat, he said finally, voice rougher. Rest. At noon we go again. Then he turned and left the hall, his steps brisk, as if walking fast could outpace the truth. After he was gone, Erisen released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her wrapped hands lay in her lap like a reminder, she was not invincible. She was not a tool that could be used without consequence. Liska sat beside her without asking and poured tea from a pot that had appeared as if by magic or by servants who knew better than to be seen. Erisen took the cup with both hands, letting the heat seep into her fingers. She stared into the dark surface, watching the steam curl. Odrin stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the corridor where Soren had gone. "He won't like this," he muttered. Erisen looked up. "Like what?" "Not being able to solve it with steel," Odrin said. His eyes flicked to her throat, then away, as if it embarrassed him to consider her fragility. "Not being the one holding the only answer." Erisen's mouth tightened. "I'm not an answer," she said softly. "I'm a person." Liska hummed in agreement. Nem hovered near the doorway, restless. His gaze darted between Erisen and the floor. Finally, he spoke in a low rush. "My sister's on the outer edge," he said. "In the village by the hedge line. If the maze keeps creeping," his voice broke. "I don't want it to reach her." Erisen's chest tightened. She set her cup down. "I'll help," she said, and meant it not as a bargain, not as a debt, but as a choice. Nem swallowed hard, looking as if he didn't know how to accept kindness without suspicion. He nodded once, sharp, and fled before anyone could see his eyes. The hours between dawn and noon passed in uneasy stillness. Erisen rested as best she could, but her mind kept circling the same images: the torn sleeve, the cold siphoning, the hedge leaning inward with patient hunger. She was being asked to soothe a starving thing. But starvation was never cured by a single song. When noon came, the keep was warmer, busier. Hedge wardens moved with new orders, no axes raised, no torches lit. Servants carried buckets of water toward the hedge line, and Erisen watched them from a corridor, puzzled. Liska appeared at her side. "Offerings," she said, catching Erisen's look. "Spring water at the roots. Compost. Not much. But better than blood." "Did Soren order that?" Erisen asked. Liska's lips pressed into a thin line. "He didn't forbid it," she said. "That's progress." Erisen huffed a quiet, surprised laugh. In the afternoon, Soren called her to the library. It was a long room lined with shelves of thick, warped volumes. The air smelled of old paper and smoke. A single window looked out toward the hedge walls, and the light that came through it was green-tinged, filtered by leaves. Soren stood at a table covered in records, ledgers, weathered journals, scraps of parchment marked with curling symbols. His hair was more disordered than in the morning. His eyes were intent, as if he'd been wrestling the page itself. He did not look up when she entered. "Come," he said, and the word was still too close to command. Erisen approached anyway. On the table lay an old journal open to a page written in a steady hand. Along the margins were drawings of the iron arch symbols. Spiral. Circle. A shape like a crown of thorns softened by blossoms. Soren tapped a line of text with a blunt finger. "This is my grandfather's steward," he said. He wrote of feeding the hedge with warm vow and willing care. His mouth tightened on the last words as if they tasted wrong. He also wrote that the hedge answers kindness with passage. Erisen leaned closer, scanning the ink. The script was cramped but clear. Her gift stirred, as if recognizing the words as more than ink. "What happened?" she asked softly. "Why did it stop?" Soren's finger hovered, then slid to another line. "A border war," he said. "My great-grandfather wanted faster control. He ordered burnings to keep the corridors predictable. It worked. For a time." His jaw clenched. "Then it became habit." Erisen's throat tightened. Habits were easier than healing. Soren's gaze finally lifted to hers. "If you can speak to it," he said, voice low, "tell me what it wants." The request startled her because it was almost an ask. Almost. Erisen swallowed. "It wants warmth," she said. "Not just heat. Warmth as in care. It's used to taking because it hasn't been given." Soren's eyes flickered, a shadow passing behind them. "And if I give," he said, each word measured, Will it stop taking? Erisen looked toward the window, where the hedge outside brushed the stone as if yearning. Not immediately, she said honestly. Starvation doesn't end the moment food appears. It takes time. Trust. Consistency. Soren's mouth tightened. Time is what we don't have. Erisen turned back to him, feeling the weight of his fear. Then we start now, she said. And you help. Not with steel. With presence. Soren's expression sharpened. What does that mean? Erisen hesitated, choosing words carefully. When we were in the maze, it reacted to force. It eased when I soothed. But I felt it lean toward us. Toward warmth. It didn't only respond to my voice. It responded to the way we moved. The way we held ourselves. Soren's gaze held hers, skeptical and intent. So you want me to walk into it, he said. Yes, Erisen said, and her pulse quickened. Not to fight. To listen. Soren's jaw worked. Pride rose in him like a shield. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded once. At dusk, he said. We go together. You sing. I listen. Erisen studied him, trying to find the trap. But if there was a trap, it was one he'd built for himself, because whatever waited inside the maze did not care for titles, only for truth. As she turned to leave, Soren spoke again, quieter. If you are lying, he said, people will die. Erisen paused in the doorway and looked back at him. If I am lying, she said, voice steady, it will not be to save myself. Because I could have saved myself by never singing in Wickarrow. Soren's gaze stayed on her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, not softness, not yet. But a fraction less certainty in his own hardness. Erisen left the library with her throat tight and her hands still aching beneath their wrappings, knowing dusk would bring her back to the maze. And this time, she would not be the only warmth it tasted. Dusk gathered over Briarholt like a held breath. By late afternoon, clouds had thickened into bruised layers, pressing low over the hedge marches. The light that filtered through the maze's outer wall turned everything green-grey, as if the world had been rinsed in leaf shadow. Torches were lit along the inner courtyard, but their flames looked frail beside the dark mass of the Varricant beyond the stone. Erisen stood at the iron arch with her cloak fastened tight and her lute case slung across her shoulder. Her hands, still wrapped from Liska's salve, felt steadier, though her throat carried a soreness that no rest could fully cure. The maze's pull sat in her chest like a low, persistent hum. It didn't feel like an invitation. It felt like need. Captain Odrin Pell and 4 hedge wardens waited with lanterns. Nem Ashk hovered behind them, jaw clenched, eyes bright with the kind of sleepless anger that could turn into recklessness at the wrong moment. And then Soren Crowthorne arrived. He did not come with a parade of guards. Only one man trailed him at a distance, a silent shadow near the courtyard wall. Soren wore a plain dark coat over travel leathers, his sword belted at his hip but his hands empty. No axe. No torch. His hair was wind-tossed, and there was a tightness around his mouth that suggested he had argued with himself all the way here. His gaze flicked to Erisen. We go in, he said, clipped. Erisen's eyes narrowed slightly. We listen, she corrected. A muscle jumped in his jaw, but he didn't argue. We listen, he repeated, and the words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth. Odrin's expression was wary. My lord, he began. Soren lifted a hand. I know what you think, he said, eyes on the iron arch. If it moves while we watch, then it can't be outwitted with maps. He glanced at Erisen again. And if it's starving, then blades only make it hungrier. Odrin's eyebrows rose. That's almost reasonable, he muttered. Nem made a bitter sound. Reasonable won't bring back the ones it took. Erisen's throat tightened, but she kept her focus on the arch. Then let's bring back who we can, she said. She drew a slow breath and sang the seam open. The note slid into the iron like a key into a lock. The hedge shivered. The thorns eased aside, reluctant and watchful. A narrow, black mouth opened between living walls. Soren stared into it for a beat, face unreadable. Then he stepped through first. Erisen blinked, surprised by the choice. Not protective. Not performative. Simply, decisive. She followed. Inside, The air was colder than before. The lantern light seemed to be swallowed faster, leaving their faces lit in trembling amber and their surroundings in thick shadow. The corridor smelled of sap and wet earth and the faint metallic tang that prickled at the back of Erisen's throat. The maze felt aware. Erisen started a low hum, soft and steady, a thread of resonance meant to keep contact without forcing. The hedge walls leaned inward slightly, as if pressing its ear to her sound. Soren walked beside her, shoulders rigid. He kept his gaze forward, but Erisen could see the tension in his hands, fingers flexing, wanting to grip a weapon that wasn't there. They reached the first fork. The left corridor was scarred with old pruning marks, the right looked fresh, glossy, sharp. Odrin started left out of habit, then stopped himself. All eyes went to Erisen. Erisen listened. Not with ears alone, but with the quiet part of her gift that felt the hedge's pulse like a second heartbeat. The left corridor felt tight, irritated. The right felt restless, hungry, but curious. She hummed a question into her tone. The right corridor eased, leaves parting a fraction. The left corridor bristled, thorns lifting like raised hackles. Right, Erisen said. Odrin nodded and motioned his people forward. Soren didn't question. He simply followed Erisen's choice with the grim focus of a man who had finally accepted that the maze was not a wall to be conquered but a creature to be met. As they walked, Erisen's breath fogged. The cold tug in the air returned, stronger than before. It was as if the maze drew warmth not only from skin but from courage itself, pulling at the inner fire people carried. Nem shivered. It's worse. It's closer, Odrin corrected, voice low. It knows we're here. Soren's eyes flicked to the hedge walls. Let it know, he said, and there was steel in the quiet words. Erisen's hum softened further. Not like that, she murmured. Soren's jaw tightened. He looked at her briefly, then away. Tell me what to do, he said, and the words came out like a concession wrestled from his teeth. It startled her. Not because he was asking, he wasn't, quite, but because he had admitted he didn't know. Erisen swallowed. Speak, she said, voice gentle. Not orders. Names. Reminders. Things you mean. Soren's brows drew together. To a hedge. To something that remembers, Erisen said. It listens differently than people do. But it listens. Soren's mouth tightened. Then, quietly, as if embarrassed to let anyone hear, he spoke into the green. Briarholt, he said. Home. The hedge walls rustled, a faint tremor through the leaves. Erisen felt her gift flare not from her own voice this time, but from the resonance of his. He wasn't a singer, but truth had its own weight. They moved deeper. The corridor began to slope gently downward, roots thickening underfoot. The air grew damper. The lantern light caught pale thorns gleaming like teeth. Ahead, the passage narrowed. Not suddenly. Slowly, patient as hunger. The walls leaned in, inch by inch. Odrin lifted a hand. Everyone stopped. Erisen's heart hammered. She felt the maze leaning toward them, tasting the warmth of their bodies. She began to sing, not a forceful note, but a lullaby cadence, steady and low, shaped like a hand smoothing fur. The narrowing paused. Then it continued. Not as fast, but still moving. Erisen's throat tightened with panic. It's not enough, she whispered. Soren's gaze snapped to her. Then make it enough. Erisen's eyes flashed. I can't feed it with breath, she hissed, and immediately regretted the sharpness. The hedge walls shuddered, thorns twitching as if responding to tension. Erisen forced her voice back into softness. Easy, she sang, but her pulse raced. Soren's expression shifted, frustration, fear, and something else, dawning understanding that he couldn't command her any more than he could command the maze. He took a slow breath. Then, in a voice rough with restraint, he spoke again, not to Erisen but to the hedge itself. You don't need to take, he said. You can have. Erisen's breath caught. The words were simple, almost foolish, and yet they carried a sincerity she could feel. The hedge hesitated. The narrowing slowed. Erisen threaded her song around his words, weaving his truth into resonance. The two sounds, her melody and his vow-shaped speech, met in the air like hands clasping. The hedge walls eased outward by a fraction. Not much, but enough. They moved through the tight passage, shoulder-brushing leaves. Thorns grazed leather and wool but did not bite skin. Nem's breath shook. "It's letting us," he whispered. Odrin's eyes were wide in lantern light. "Don't ruin it," he muttered. They reached a small widening, a place where the corridor opened into a rough chamber. The hedge walls arched overhead, interwoven like ribs. In the center stood a cluster of old posts, wooden stakes driven into the root mat, wrapped in rotting ribbon and faded twine. An offering place. And beside it, half slumped against the hedge wall, was a figure. A woman. Her grey hair was tangled loose, her dress torn at the hem, and dried sap clung to her sleeves. Her face was pale, eyes closed. One hand was still lifted as if she had been reaching for something when she fell. "Liska," Erisen breathed. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Odrin surged forward, stopping short of touching the hedge wall itself. "Matron," he barked, voice cracking. Nem made a strangled sound. Soren's face went blank with a kind of controlled horror. "How?" he said, voice low. "She was in the keep." Erisen's mind spun. Liska had been in the hall. In the library corridor. She had moved like someone anchored to Briarholt. Unless the maze had reached. Erisen felt it then, like a cold hand on the back of her neck. The Varricant wasn't only a place. It was a living net. Its corridors could tug at the edges of the keep. It could swallow a person through a door left open, a hedge line brushed too close. It had taken Liska because Liska had been close to Erisen. Close to warmth. Close to change. "Don't touch the wall," Erisen warned, voice tight. "It's holding her." Odrin hovered, trembling with the effort of not acting. Erisen stepped closer, heart pounding. Liska's breathing was faint but present. Her lips were slightly blue, as if the maze had drawn warmth from her too long. Erisen's throat burned. She had already sung today. Too much singing would strip her voice raw. But Liska had wrapped her hands and fed her broth and told her she was tired of fear being mistaken for strength. Erisen began to sing. The melody was careful, low, coaxing. She shaped it to loosen the hedge's grip the way one loosens fingers around something precious. She poured warmth into the sound, not forcing, offering. The hedge trembled. Thorns eased slightly away from Liska's shoulders. But the maze did not release her. It leaned in, cold and hungry, as if demanding payment for what it held. Erisen's chest tightened. Her voice wavered. Soren stepped forward. Odrin's hand shot out. "My lord," Soren lifted a palm, stopping him. His gaze was fixed on Liska's pale face, then on the hedge wall that cradled her like a prison. Erisen felt his presence beside her, solid, tense, and strangely steady. "What does it want?" Soren asked, voice low. Erisen's eyes stung. "Warmth," she whispered. "But not just heat. It wants proof. That we won't only take." Soren's jaw clenched. His eyes flicked to the hedge, then to Erisen. "Tell me," he said again, and this time it wasn't command. It was request. Erisen swallowed, throat raw. "Speak her name," she said. "Offer something that matters to you. Not a threat. Not an order. A gift." Soren's lips pressed together. The idea clearly repulsed some part of his training. Lords did not bargain with hedges. Lords did not offer gifts to things that should obey. But Liska's blue lips were an argument no pride could win. Soren knelt on the root mat, close enough for the hedge's leaves to brush his shoulders. He set his gloved hand on the ground, palm down, as if grounding himself. He took a slow breath. "Liska Fen," he said, and his voice roughened on the name. "You've kept my house standing when my father couldn't. When I couldn't." Erisen's song faltered for a heartbeat at the naked truth of it. Soren continued, gaze fixed on the hedge wall. "You've fed my people. Held their grief. You've argued with me when no one else dared." His mouth tightened as if the confession cost him blood. "I won't lose you to my own failure." The hedge rustled. The thorns quivered, not striking, but listening. Soren's hand moved to his throat. He unfastened the clasp of his coat, a dull metal piece shaped like crossed briars. The emblem of his house. He held it out toward the hedge wall. Take this, he said quietly. Take my sign. Take my pride. Let her go. Oedran sucked in a sharp breath. Nem stared, eyes wide. Erisen's heart hammered so hard she felt it in her throat. The hedge leaned in. Leaves brushed Soren's fingers. A thorn pressed against the metal clasp, testing it. Erisen kept singing, weaving warmth around Soren's offering, threading his sincerity into resonance like a binding stitch. The maze shuddered. Then, slowly, the hedge wall eased away from Liska's body. Not completely. Not freely. But enough that Liska's shoulder slid forward onto the root mat, her weight shifting away from the thorn cradle. Oedran moved instantly, careful not to touch the wall. He hooked his arm under Liska's back and dragged her gently away from the hedge, inch by inch, as if pulling someone from a river's undertow. The hedge rustled again, thorns lifting. Erisen's voice rose slightly, firm but still gentle, and Soren spoke over it, a low counterharmony. No, he said. Enough. The hedge froze. Oedran pulled Liska fully clear. Nem fell to his knees beside her, fumbling for her wrist. She's alive, he whispered, voice breaking. She's alive. Erisen's song died in her throat as relief hit her so hard her knees nearly buckled. Soren remained kneeling for a moment, his hand still extended. The hedge wall held the briar clasp now, half swallowed by leaves as if the maze had accepted the offering. Soren stared at it, expression unreadable. Then he stood, slowly, and turned toward Erisen. For the first time since she'd met him, his gaze held something that wasn't control. It was a kind of shaken gratitude, awkward, unfamiliar, and fiercely contained. You were right, he said, voice low. Erisen swallowed, throat aching. About what? Soren's eyes flicked to Liska, to the hedge, to the chamber itself. It listens, he said. And it doesn't answer pain the way I thought it did. Erisen's chest tightened. She wanted to say something sharp, something triumphant, but all she felt was exhaustion and a strange tenderness for the man who had just offered his pride to a hungry hedge. Oedran lifted Liska carefully, cradling her as if she were made of glass. We need to get her out, he said. Erisen nodded, swallowing the burn in her throat. The maze will try to shift, she warned. It won't like letting her go. Soren stepped to her side again, close enough that his sleeve brushed her cloak. The contact was slight, but it sent heat through her like a sudden lantern flare. He lowered his voice. Tell me what to do, he said again. And I will do it. Erisen's pulse stumbled. Not because of the words alone, but because he meant them. Stay steady, she whispered. Don't threaten. Don't hate it. Speak like you spoke just now, truth, not steel. Soren's jaw clenched. Truth is harder, he muttered. I know, Erisen said softly. They started back through the corridors, Oedran carrying Liska, Nem hovering close, lanterns trembling. The hedge walls rustled and creaked around them, shifting in slow, restless waves. The cold tug returned, stronger now, as if the maze mourned the warmth it had lost. Erisen forced her breath into a low hum again, but her voice scraped, raw from strain. Her vision blurred at the edges. Soren noticed. His gaze flicked to her mouth, then to her pale fingers gripping her lute strap. Without speaking, he shrugged off his coat and thrust it into her arms. Erisen stared, startled. Soren, wear it, he said, voice blunt. It's warmer than yours. It's not a gift, he snapped, then softened a fraction, as if catching himself. It's practical. Erisen's lips twitched despite herself. Practical. That was his shield. It always would be. She pulled the coat around her shoulders. It smelled like smoke and cold air and something faintly sharp, sap, perhaps. It held his warmth in its lining, and the unexpected intimacy of that warmth made her throat tighten more than the singing had. They reached the iron arch. Erisen's voice was too strained to sing it open again. For a heartbeat, panic flashed through her. If she couldn't open it, Soren stepped forward. He placed one gloved hand on the iron, fingers splayed over the carved symbols. Spiral. Circle. Thorn crown softened in blossom. He took a slow breath, as if remembering how he had spoken to the hedge in the chamber. Home, he said quietly. Open. Erisen held her breath. The hedge shuddered. The seam appeared. Not wide, not graceful, but present, a narrow opening easing into being as if the maze recognized his voice now, too. Oedran exhaled hard. Nem stared. Erisen's chest filled with startled hope that hurt. They stepped through into the courtyard, dusk air rushing over them like water. The torches along the wall looked suddenly bright and ordinary. Servants cried out when they saw Liska in Oedran's arms. Footsteps rushed. Hands reached. Liska's eyelids fluttered, and a weak sound escaped her throat. Erisen sagged against the stone pillar by the arch, Soren's coat heavy on her shoulders. Her voice was gone to a painful whisper. Soren hovered for a moment, then stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "You saved her," he said quietly. Erisen lifted her gaze, throat burning. "You did," she rasped. "It listened to you." Soren's jaw clenched. His eyes held hers, steady and intense, as if he were trying to understand a world that had tilted under his feet. "I offered it my crest," he said, voice rough. "My father's symbol. My family's claim." Erisen swallowed. "And it took it," she whispered. "Because you meant it." Soren's hands flexed, empty now of that emblem. "What happens when it wants more?" he asked, low. "When it takes again?" Erisen stared past him at the hedge wall, where the Varricant rose like a living sea beyond the courtyard. In the torchlight, she thought she saw a ripple of pale blossoms deep within the green, brief, like a sigh. "It will," she admitted. "Hunger doesn't vanish. But we proved something today." She lifted her gaze back to him. "We proved it can be answered without blood." Soren's expression tightened, then softened so slightly she almost missed it. "And we proved something else," he said, quieter still. Erisen's pulse tripped. "What?" Soren held her gaze for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw fear, not of the maze, but of what he had just begun to learn about gentleness. About needing someone. About the fact that strength might require surrendering control. Then he looked away first, as if the moment burned. "That your voice," he said, voice clipped again, "is not the only thing it listens to." Erisen's breath caught. Soren turned and strode after the servants carrying Liska, his pace brisk, shoulders squared, as if walking fast could hide the tremor of change. Erisen remained by the arch, Soren's coat wrapped around her like borrowed warmth, staring at the hedge wall. Somewhere within the maze, something shifted, not with a snap of thorns, but with a slow, searching rustle. As if the Varricant were listening for the next true thing it could trust. By morning, the whole keep knew Liska Fen had been taken and returned. That kind of story didn't stay contained behind stone walls. It seeped out through servant gossip and hedge warden mutters, and the careful, hopeful looks villagers gave the Varricant from a distance, as if it might suddenly decide to be merciful again. Liska herself tried to pretend she hadn't been close to dying. She sat upright in her bed with a shawl around her shoulders and a cup of broth in her hands, and when Erisen slipped in quietly to check on her, Liska's eyes sharpened like a blade. "You look like you swallowed a thorn," Liska said. Erisen's throat tightened. "I'm glad you're awake." Liska snorted softly. "Hard to sleep with everyone fluttering like nervous hens." Her gaze flicked to Erisen's mouth, lingering on the faint redness there. "Don't ruin your voice, girl. It's the only thing between this house and teeth." Erisen's hands curled on her skirt. "It listened to him," she whispered. Liska's eyes narrowed. "It listened," she agreed. "That's not the same as it being tamed." Erisen shook her head. "I don't want it tamed." Liska's expression softened by a fraction. "Good," she said. "Because a thing that's alive should not be treated like furniture." Erisen swallowed, feeling warmth and ache mix in her chest. "He gave up his crest." "I heard," Liska said, and there was something like wonder threaded through her practical tone. "A man does not do that lightly." Erisen thought of the briar clasp half swallowed by leaves, pride given like a coin into a beggar's palm. "He did it without thinking," she said, though she knew that wasn't quite true. "He had thought. He had simply chosen anyway." Liska shifted, wincing, and waved Erisen closer. "Listen to me," she said, voice low. "Haven Ma will come. He'll smell change the way rats smell spilled grain. He'll want what you are." Erisen's stomach sank. I know. Liska's gaze pinned her. And Soren will want to fight him the way Soren fights everything. Erisen's lips pressed together. His learning. Liska's smile was brief and sharp. Then pray he learns quickly. The warning lived in Erisen's bones as she left the chamber. All day, Briarholt moved like a body bracing for impact. Hedge wardens worked the perimeter without cutting, hauling compost, pouring spring water at root lines, murmuring low work songs that sounded half ridiculous and half sacred. Servants carried bundles of dried herbs to hang at doorways. Sister Jorin Quill arrived from the chapel library by the outer village, her hood damp with mist, her arms full of books wrapped in oilcloth. Soren met her in the library and did not bother with courtesies. He listened, jaw tight, as she laid out brittle pages filled with old symbols. Your house once knew the difference between binding and breaking, Sister Jorin said, calm as winter water. The Varricant was planted as sanctuary, not snare. It answered vow and care, not steel. Soren's eyes were dark, sleepless. And now it is starving, Jorin said, glancing toward the green-tinged window. Starving things bite. Starving things forget. Erisen stood near the table, feeling the words hum against her gift like a struck chord. If it forgot, she asked, voice rough with caution, how do we remind it? Jorin looked at her with quiet interest. You remind it the way you remind any living thing, she said. With consistency. Soren's mouth tightened. We don't have time for years of gentle tending. Jorin's gaze did not waver. Then you will need a vow that holds, she said, and tapped the page where spiral symbols curled around a closed circle. A promise made freely. Witnessed by the hedge. The old steward called it a steward's vow. Soren's fingers flexed on the table edge. My family. Your family's vows thinned when they started treating the hedge like a prisoner, Jorin said softly. A vow spoken with contempt is not a vow a living sanctuary can trust. Silence spread, tight as wire. Erisen felt Soren's attention shift to her, sharp and unsettling. Not possession. Not command. A kind of desperate calculation, because her voice was the only bridge they'd found, and she knew it. I won't be owned by a vow, Erisen said quietly before he could speak. Soren's jaw clenched. I know, he said, and the words sounded like they cost him. That's why it might work. Erisen's heart stumbled at the grim honesty of it. If he tried to claim her, he would lose her and the maze would tighten its teeth again. He knew that now, and knowing did not soothe him. It only forced him to change. Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Odrin Pell entered, face drawn. My lord, he said. Riders at the outer road. Reeve Mars colors. The air in the library seemed to tilt. Erisen's hands went cold. Liska's warning pressed hard against her ribs. Soren straightened as if steel rods had been slid into his spine. How many? 2 wagons, Odrin said. 12 soldiers. More behind, likely. His gaze flicked to Erisen, then away. He's not here to trade pleasantries. Soren's mouth tightened. He won't step inside my keep with armed men. Odrin's expression was grim. He might not ask. Soren turned to Erisen. His eyes held hers, intense, and for once there was no pretense that this was simple. Stay in the inner rooms, he said. Erisen's chin lifted. No, she said, quietly but firmly. Soren's jaw flexed. Erisen. If I hide, I become exactly what he thinks I am, she said. A thing to be fetched when needed. Her voice steadied. And if he comes for me, he will come for me wherever I am. Soren's nostrils flared. For a heartbeat she saw the old instinct lock her away, control the variable, clamp down. Then his gaze flicked to Sister Jorin's open page, to the spiral symbols, to the closed circle. He exhaled slowly. Then you will stand where I can see you, he said. Where my walls can protect you. Erisen's throat tightened at the possessive edge of the words. But under it was something else, fear of losing people again. Fear of losing her. I'll stand, she said. But I won't be used as bait. Soren's eyes held hers, then nodded once, sharp. Agreed. They moved to the courtyard. Mar arrived with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted without consequences falling on someone else. He rode at the front, cloak lined in fur despite the mild day, his hair oiled, his mouth set in a faintly amused curve. Behind him marched soldiers in clean mail, and 2 clerks carrying sealed scrolls. He dismounted before the gate as if stepping onto his own property. "Lord Crowthorne," he called, voice carrying. What a relief. There were concerning reports. Soren stood at the top of the courtyard steps, hands clasped behind his back. He wore no crest now, only plain dark cloth, but he looked like the keep itself, stone holding against wind. "Reeve Ma," Soren said, cool. "You bring arms into my yard." "For protection," Ma replied smoothly. His gaze slid toward the hedge walls and lingered with a theatrical shudder. "Given the unfortunate events, I thought it wise." "You thought it wise," Soren echoed, and the faint emphasis made it a quiet accusation. Ma's smile widened. "And I thought it wise to bring documentation." He nodded to one of the clerks, who unrolled a scroll with a flourish. Wax seals glinted red. Ma's eyes found Erisen where she stood slightly behind Soren, near the door's shadow. He looked her over the way a merchant looks at fabric, judging worth, planning ownership. "There you are," Ma said. "The singer." Erisen's fingers curled. She forced her face calm. "My name is Erisen Vale," she said. Ma's gaze didn't warm. A useful name for a useful talent. He turned back to Soren. "Your border is unstable. Your hedge is murderous. The crown cannot allow a private lord to endanger trade routes and villages." His tone shifted into something official. "Therefore, the crown claims stewardship of any resource necessary to contain the threat. Including the girl." Erisen's stomach turned. Soren's voice was ice. "She is not a resource." Ma's brows lifted, amused. "No." He spread his hands. "Then you won't mind handing her over freely. For the good of the realm." Erisen felt Soren's tension spike beside her like a drawn bowstring. "She stays," Soren said. Ma's smile thinned. "You're refusing a crown directive." "I'm refusing theft," Soren replied. Ma sighed as if disappointed in a child. "Lord Crowthorne, you are exhausted. You are frightened. You have lost people." His eyes flicked toward the hedge wall. "You've also, I hear, begun placating the maze with water and compost. Songs." He let a soft laugh escape. "You're softening." A murmur ran through the hedge wardens lining the courtyard. Odrin's hands tightened into fists. Nem's jaw clenched hard enough to crack. Soren's voice remained level, but Erisen could hear the edge under it. "Leave." Ma's gaze slid back to Erisen, sharpening. "I'm not leaving without what I came for." Erisen stepped forward half a pace, heart pounding. "I won't go," she said. Ma's eyes narrowed. "You don't decide." Erisen's voice stayed steady, though her pulse hammered in her throat. "I do," she said. "I am not your tool." Ma's mouth tightened with annoyance, as if a chair had spoken out of turn. "Then you are a stubborn tool." Soren moved. Not in front of her like a shield, he stepped beside her, shoulder nearly touching hers, a quiet alignment that made her breath catch. "She decided," Soren said, voice low and dangerous. "Now you decide whether you leave with your soldiers walking, or whether you leave carried." Ma's eyes widened slightly, then turned cold. "Threats," he murmured. "So the reports were correct." Soren's face didn't change. "Last warning." Ma's gaze flicked over Soren's plain coat, as if noticing the missing crest for the first time. His smile returned, thin, sharp. "No," he said softly. "You won't be in a position to give warnings much longer." He nodded once. One of the soldiers raised a torch. Erisen's blood ran cold. "No," she cried, and the sound rasped in her throat. The torch arced through the air and landed at the base of the outer hedge line where dry bramble had been piled from earlier pruning. Flame caught fast. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Just crackle, smoke, a lick of orange against green. Then the hedge shuddered like an animal kicked awake. A sound rolled across the courtyard, not a roar, but a vast intake of breath. The hedge wall along the outer perimeter surged, branches thickening, thorns lifting, leaves trembling with furious motion. The ground underfoot seemed to tighten. The Varricant answered fire the way a starving thing answers pain. with teeth. Thorns burst upward along the courtyard's edge, snaking over stone like living whips. A soldier screamed as barbs hooked his calf and yanked. Another swung his sword wildly and was pulled into green shadow, his cry cut short. Panic exploded. Mars soldiers scattered, shouting orders that meant nothing to a living labyrinth. Inside, Odrin roared, shoving hedge wardens toward the doors. Servants shrieked and fled. Smoke poured over the courtyard, bitter and thick. Erisen's gift flared like a struck bell. The maze's rage pressed against her chest, hot and cold at once, burning outrage wrapped around hunger. She tried to sing, but her throat caught on smoke. Soren grabbed her wrist, firm. Move, he snapped. They ran for the inner hall, Odrin and Nem close behind, dragging 2 wounded men with them. The door slammed as thorns struck stone outside with a sound like spears. Inside, the keep shook. Dust drifted from beams. Somewhere, glass shattered. Erisen's lungs burned. She coughed hard, eyes watering. Soren didn't let go of her wrist until they reached the library. Sister Jorin was already there, gathering books with brisk, practiced movements. He burned it, she said, voice flat with anger. Fool. Can you stop it? Soren demanded. Jorin's gaze flicked to Erisen. She can soothe, she said. You can vow. But stopping it, her mouth tightened. You can't stop a living sanctuary from defending itself after you set it on fire. Another crash shook the keep. A window rattled in its frame. Erisen forced her breathing slow. It's not defending, she rasped. It's starving and hurt. Soren's eyes flashed to her. Then feed it, he snapped. Erisen's temper flared, sharp and weary. With what? She hissed. More breath. I'm not endless. The words hit him like a slap. His jaw clenched. For a heartbeat, he looked as if he might snap back. Then his gaze dropped to her throat, to the rawness there, to the tremor in her hands. He exhaled, slow, and something in him shifted, an ugly, necessary realization. He could not demand her to be more than human. Outside, a scream cut off abruptly. Soren's eyes hardened, not at Erisen, but at the situation. Ma, he said, voice low. Where is he? Odrin burst into the library, face streaked with soot. He's trying to force his way to the inner rooms, he barked. He thinks if he gets the girl, he can make her sing it back. Erisen's stomach lurched. Soren's gaze locked onto her. He won't, he said. It wasn't a plan. It was a vow-shaped promise made with raw certainty. A pounding sounded down the corridor, boots, shouting. Soren moved fast. Odrin, he said. Take Jorin and the wounded to the cellar passage. Seal it. Keep them safe. Odrin hesitated. My lord. Go, Soren snapped. Odrin grabbed Jorin's elbow and hauled her toward the hidden door behind the shelves. Nem hovered, eyes wide, then followed with a wounded man's arm slung over his shoulder. Erisen took a step back, heart racing. What are you doing? Soren's eyes held hers, fierce. I'm not letting him take you, he said. And I'm not letting my keep become a battlefield for his greed. Erisen's breath hitched. So what? A crash at the library door cut her off. The latch shuddered. Soren's hand closed around Erisen's forearm. We go to the maze, he said. Erisen stared. Now. His gaze flicked to the thorn-tinged window where green shadows writhed outside. It's already here, he said grimly. Better we choose where we meet it. The door splintered. Mar's soldiers surged in, smoke-streaked and furious. Mar himself stood behind them, eyes bright with triumph. There, Mar said, voice carrying through chaos. Take her. Erisen's blood went cold. She tried to sing, but her throat was raw and smoke-choked. Soren moved like a storm. He shoved a table into the path of the first soldier, then dragged Erisen toward the side door that led to the inner courtyard. A blade flashed. Soren knocked it aside with his forearm, grimacing as metal scraped leather. Move, he snarled at Erisen, and for once it wasn't command out of habit, it was the urgent language of survival. They burst into the corridor. Shouts followed. Erisen stumbled as the floor shook. The keep felt like a ship in rough water, timbers groaning, stones trembling. They reached a service stair and ran down, then up again, moving through passages that smelled of damp and smoke and crushed herbs. Servants darted like frightened rabbits, eyes wide. A thorny vine punched through a hallway window ahead, cracking the frame and spilling leaves and barbs across the floor. Erisen's gift flared. She heard the maze in her bones now, an enormous, frantic hunger and pain. Soren dragged her around the vine, then shoved open a small door that led directly into the courtyard near the iron arch. Outside, the world was chaos. Flames licked at the outer hedge line where Mars' torch had struck. Smoke rolled, thick and choking. The Varricant surged like a living sea, thorn whips striking, corridors shifting, green walls rising where there had been open yard moments before. Soldiers screamed. Hedge wardens shouted, trying to pull people free without cutting, without feeding the maze's rage. The iron arch stood half swallowed by new growth, as if the maze wanted to seal itself and everything inside it. Soren didn't hesitate. He shoved Erisen toward the arch. "Sing," he said. Erisen's throat burned. Her voice was nearly gone. But she felt the arch symbols like pressure against her gift, and she knew if it sealed, there would be no root left. She forced breath into her lungs and sang a single, trembling note. The seam opened, narrow, ragged, reluctant. Soren pushed her through. They stepped into the maze, and the world closed behind them with a rustle like a mouth shutting. The air inside was colder than any winter night. Not merely cool, hungry cold, as if warmth itself were being drained. Erisen's breath fogged instantly. Her fingers went numb despite gloves. Behind them, the seam shivered. Leaves pressed inward. Erisen tried to sing again to hold it open, but her voice cracked. Panic flared. Soren grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes were fierce and dark. "Breathe," he said, low and urgent. "Slow." Erisen swallowed hard. She drew a shaky breath. Soren's gaze flicked to the seam. He placed his hand on the iron and spoke, voice rough but steady. "Open," he said. "Hold." The seam hesitated, then steadied, as if recognizing his voice as a thing that mattered now. Erisen's chest tightened with startled, painful gratitude. Then the maze shifted. The corridor behind them twisted, not away from the courtyard but deeper, dragging them inward like a current. Soren's hand closed around Erisen's again, firm. "We move," he said. They ran. Branches leaned in. Thorns scraped leather. The maze didn't strike hard, it didn't need to. It guided, herded, pulled them along with slow, relentless pressure. Erisen's gift hummed, overwhelmed. The maze's hunger pressed against her throat like a demand. She tried to hum softly, to soothe, but her voice was too weak. The sound came out as breath and pain. Soren noticed. He tightened his grip on her hand, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to keep her anchored. "Don't waste it," he said, and there was something gentler beneath the bluntness. "Save what you have." Erisen's eyes stung. "Save it for what?" The thought flashed like lightning. For a vow. They rounded a corner and the corridor widened abruptly. They entered a chamber that made Erisen stop dead. It was vast, an open space where hedge walls rose in interwoven arches like the ribs of a cathedral. Pale saplight pulsed through the leaves, casting a faint glow as if the maze had lit itself from within. The air smelled sweet and raw, like crushed blossoms and wet wood. In the center, roots knotted into a raised dais. Around it, thorns curved inward not like weapons, but like hands clasped in prayer. Erisen's breath caught. This wasn't a trap corridor. It felt core, heart. Soren stared, jaw clenched. "What is this?" Erisen swallowed, her gift trembling. "The heart," she whispered. "Or something like it." The maze shifted behind them. The corridor they'd entered through folded closed. Leaves wove together. The chamber sealed. Panic surged up Erisen's spine. "We're trapped," she rasped. Soren's face went still. "No," he said, voice low. "We're invited." The word sounded wrong and right at once. The air grew colder as if the maze leaned toward them. Erisen felt the tug on her warmth, stronger than ever. Her knees threatened to buckle. Soren's hand tightened around hers. He stepped closer to her, not shielding, not crowding, simply sharing space in a way that steadied her. I can't sing it open, Erisen whispered, and shame burned behind her eyes. Not like this. Soren's gaze held hers, fierce. Then we do what Jorin said, he murmured. Erisen's heart hammered. A vow. Soren's jaw clenched. A vow, he echoed, and she heard fear in it, not of thorns, but of the truth a vow would require. Erisen turned her face toward the hedge arches. She could feel the maze's hunger pressing like a question. What will you give? Her throat burned. She could barely speak. But vow magic wasn't about volume. It was about congruence, truth matching sound. She stepped toward the root dais, legs shaking. The saplight pulsed faintly, as if responding to her movement. Soren followed, slower, as if each step cost him. Erisen glanced back at him. His face was tight, eyes dark with conflict. You don't have to, she whispered. He laughed once, harsh and humorless. I do, he said. If my people are dying, and this is the only thing that answers, his eyes flicked to the green arches. I can't keep cutting until there's nothing left but blood. The honesty of it hit her hard. She saw, in that moment, the shape of his internal wound. Years of believing cruelty was the price of protection, and now the world demanding a different payment. Erisen swallowed, fighting tears. The vow has to be free, she rasped. Not forced. Not because you're cornered. Soren's gaze snapped to hers. I am cornered, he said, voice low. But I'm not being forced. Not by you. His eyes held hers, and for the first time his intensity felt like something other than control. It felt like choice sharpened into resolve. I choose. Warmth flared in Erisen's chest despite the cold. She nodded, throat tight. Then speak, she whispered. Plain. True. Not pretty. Soren stepped onto the root dais. The maze shivered. Thorns did not strike. They leaned in. Soren drew a slow breath. His shoulders rose and fell, as if he were steadying himself before battle. But this battle had no blade. I am Soren Crowthorne, he said, voice rough. Of Briarholt. The saplight brightened slightly. Erisen felt her gift stir, faint but present, like an ember. She lifted her chin and let a low, thin thread of tone hum beneath his words, not taking over, only supporting, weaving resonance into the air. Soren swallowed, gaze fixed on the hedge arches as if speaking to them required more courage than speaking to men. My house made you to protect, he said. We used you to punish. We cut you when you were afraid, and we burned you when you were hungry. His voice tightened. We took and called it stewardship. Erisen's throat clenched. Her hum wavered. She steadied it, gentle, like a hand on a trembling shoulder. Soren's hands curled into fists at his sides. I will not do that again, he said, and the words came out like a vow already forming. I will not feed you fear and blood. The maze rustled, a long sound like a breath released. Erisen felt the cold tug pause, listening. Soren's voice softened, rougher with sincerity. I will tend you, he said. Not with fire. Not with cruelty. With paid hands and careful pruning. With water at your roots. With offerings you can use. He swallowed hard. With songs, if you'll have them. Erisen's eyes stung. Her hum wrapped around his words, threading them into resonance, not commanding the maze, offering it the shape of promise. Soren's jaw clenched. And if you hunger, he continued, I will not let you starve until you bite my people. I will learn what you need. I will listen. The word listen landed like a stone dropped into still water. The saplight pulsed brighter, a soft green glow rising through the leaves. Erisen felt the maze's presence shift. Still hungry, still hurt, but curious. As if it had not heard sincerity from a Crowthorne in a very long time. Soren's voice shook slightly, almost imperceptible. I will protect my people, he said, without making them afraid of me. His throat worked. I will not use fear as my tool. Erisen's breath caught. That was the hardest vow. She could feel it, the part of him that wanted fear because fear was simple, and control was comfort. Soren stared into the hedge arches as if daring them to hold him to it. I offer you my stewardship, he said, voice low. Not as a chain. As a promise. The maze shuddered. The thorns above them trembled, not striking, but transforming. Tiny buds pushed out along pale barbs, as if the hedge had been holding its breath for centuries and finally exhaled something other than anger. Erisen's heart hammered. She felt her gift flare, not from effort but from alignment, truth meeting resonance. She lifted her voice, thin but clear, and sang a single phrase to bind the vow into sound. Not words. A cadence shaped like a closed circle. The chamber answered. The cold tug loosened. Warmth seeped back into Erisen's fingers. The air filled with a faint sweet scent like early spring. Then a new sound rose, footsteps. No. Beyond the sealed corridor, muffled shouts echoed, distant but present. Mars men. Searching. Forced inward by the maze's rage. Erisen's stomach tightened. They're coming, she whispered. Soren's face hardened. Let them, he said, voice low. They want it inside. They can see what it means. The hedge walls at the far end of the chamber parted like curtains drawn aside. A corridor opened, wide and lit by saplight. Not toward the courtyard. Toward the outer maze. A path offered. Erisen stared. It's showing us. Soren's gaze flicked to her. In his eyes she saw a fierce, shaken wonder. It accepted, he murmured. Erisen's throat tightened. For now, she whispered. Vows are choices made again and again. Soren nodded once, sharp. Then I'll keep choosing, he said, and the blunt sincerity of it made her chest ache. They moved down the offered corridor. As they walked, blossoms unfurled along the walls, small, pale flowers that softened the thorns into something almost gentle. The sight was so strange it made Erisen's eyes sting. A bridal wreath, her mind whispered, absurdly, and she almost laughed at the thought in the middle of smoke and danger. Ahead, the corridor widened into a junction where other passages fed in, dark, shifting, angry. Voices echoed there, Mars men, shouting, panicked. Erisen's gift hummed, sensing tension. The maze's rage hadn't vanished. It had been redirected, steadied by vow. But the pain from fire still burned through its green. Soren stepped forward, shoulders squared. He didn't draw his sword. He spoke. Stop, he called, voice carrying into the corridors. Shouts faltered. Boots scraped. A soldier stumbled into the saplit junction, eyes wide at the blooming walls. Behind him came two more, then Ma himself, soot-streaked, cloak torn, eyes blazing with fury and fear. Ma stopped short when he saw the blossoms. His gaze snapped to Soren, then to Erisen. What is this? He demanded, voice harsh. Erisen's throat was raw, but she forced words out. Consequences, she rasped. Ma's face twisted. You did this. Soren's voice was ice. You did, he corrected. Ma's eyes darted to the blooming walls as if trying to calculate how to control them. It's still a weapon, he hissed. A resource. Give her to me and we can. No, Soren said, flat. Ma's lips curled. You think you can keep her? You think your little vow makes you king of thorns? His gaze flicked to the blossoms with contempt. Softness won't hold when the crown comes with fire. Soren's jaw clenched. Then the crown will burn itself again, he said. And the realm will see who lit the torch. Ma's face flushed with rage. He stepped forward. You defy the crown. You shelter a dangerous witch. You. The hedge walls rustled. Erisen felt the maze lean, listening. Soren's voice dropped, deadly calm. Say her name, he said, and the command was for Ma. Ma blinked, thrown. What? She is not witch, Soren said. She is not resource. She is Erisen Vale. Erisen's breath caught. The words struck her harder than she expected, public acknowledgement, not as property, not as tool, but as person. Ma's mouth tightened with disgust. Fine, he spat. Erisen Vale. You will come with me. The hedge snapped. Not at Erisen. Not at Soren. A thorn whipped out from the wall beside Ma, hooking his cloak and yanking him hard enough that he stumbled backward with a curse. His soldiers shouted, stumbling away, eyes wide. The maze didn't like being spoken to like a chain. Soren stepped closer to Ma, gaze cold. Leave, he said. Now. Or it will decide you are part of the hunger you fed. Mar's face went pale, then flushed again with humiliation. He yanked his cloak free, tearing fabric. This isn't over, he hissed. Soren's eyes didn't blink. It is, he said quietly. You wanted control. You got chaos. Now you answer for it. Mar glared at Erisen with venom. You'll regret this, he snarled. Erisen's throat burned, but her gaze stayed steady. I already did, she whispered, and the truth of it tasted like iron. 4 years. The maze rustled again, blossoms trembling like breath. Mar's soldiers grabbed him, dragging him down a dark corridor away from the saplit path, desperate to get out of the living green. The maze let them go, corridors shifting behind them like doors closing. When their voices faded, Erisen sagged slightly, exhaustion crashing over her. Soren turned to her at once, tension still in his shoulders but his gaze sharp with concern. Can you walk? Erisen swallowed. Yes, she rasped, though her legs shook. Soren's hand hovered near her elbow, then stopped, as if remembering she wasn't a thing to be handled without permission. The restraint itself was a kind of gentleness. I won't touch you unless you want me to, he said, voice low, awkward with sincerity. The words made Erisen's chest tighten. She nodded once. Just, stay close, she whispered. Soren moved beside her, close enough that his sleeve brushed her cloak again. The contact was light, but it anchored her. They followed the saplit corridor as it guided them upward. When the iron arch came into view, it was no longer choked with furious new growth. The seam waited, visible, as if the maze had decided it wanted them to leave safely. Erisen's eyes stung. Soren placed his hand on the iron and spoke, voice steady. Home, he said. The seam opened. They stepped through into the courtyard. Smoke still drifted, but the fire had died down to smoldering patches where hedge wardens worked with water and wet cloth, careful not to hack. The Varricant's outer wall no longer surged like a storm. It stood tall and trembling, but in places pale blossoms dotted the green like hesitant peace offerings. People stared when Erisen and Soren emerged, hedge wardens, servants, villagers clustered at the gate. Their faces were streaked with soot and fear. Odrin pushed through the crowd, eyes wild until he saw Soren's face and Erisen's. My lord, he choked. Soren nodded once. It's contained, he said. For now. Odrin's gaze flicked to the blossoms along the hedge line, disbelief and hope fighting in his expression. What did you do? Soren's eyes slid to Erisen. We promised, he said simply. Erisen swayed. The courtyard tilted. A strong arm caught her, careful, firm. Nem. He steadied her without squeezing, eyes wide and earnest. You did it, he whispered. Erisen's throat tightened. We did, she corrected, voice barely audible. Nem's gaze flicked to Soren with a kind of bewildered respect. Soren looked away quickly, as if the attention burned. Liska appeared at the doorway, wrapped in a shawl, face pale but eyes sharp. She took in the soot, the blossoms, the way the hedge no longer thrashed. Then she looked at Soren. Did you finally learn, she asked, voice dry, that you can't bully a starving thing into gratitude? Soren's jaw clenched. Yes, he said, and there was no defensiveness in it. Only exhaustion. And I lit the first bucket myself. Liska's brows lifted. Well, she murmured. There's hope for you yet. Erisen let out a breath that trembled into something like laughter and something like a sob. Soren's gaze found her, intense, and for a moment the courtyard noise faded behind the look. You're shaking, he said quietly. Erisen swallowed. So are you, she whispered back. His eyes flicked away, then returned, and in them she saw it, fear, gratitude, and a tenderness he didn't know how to carry. I meant what I said, he murmured. All of it. Erisen's chest ached. Then keep meaning it, she whispered. Even when it's hard. Soren nodded once, sharp and solemn. I will. Above them, the hedge wall rustled. A few pale blossoms drifted down like confetti made of spring. Erisen watched them fall and felt the maze's presence, still immense, still hungry in places, but quieter now, as if listening for the next act of care. The crisis hadn't ended. Not truly. But something had shifted. The Varricant had stopped biting at their shadows, and began, cautiously, to bloom. The first night after the fire, no one slept well. Briarholt's halls echoed with the soft shuffle of hedge wardens changing shifts, the murmur of servants carrying water, the faint clink of buckets set down and picked up again. Smoke lingered in the stones, stubborn as memory. Outside, the Varricant rustled now and then, an enormous living thing settling its wounded parts, testing the edges of its own restraint. Erisen lay awake in her small chamber with Soren's coat folded at the foot of her bed. Her throat still felt scraped raw, as if each breath dragged across thorn. When she closed her eyes, she saw saplight and blossoms unfurling on barbs like a miracle that had bruises beneath it. A soft knock came. Before she could answer, Liska Fen entered, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, eyes bright with the fierce stubbornness of the newly recovered. "I heard you didn't eat," Liska said, as if Erisen's hunger were a personal insult. Erisen's mouth twitched. "I tried." Liska set a bowl on the table, porridge thick with honey and a small dish of stewed apples. "Trying is for doors that stick," she said. "Eat." Erisen obeyed because Liska's tone left no room for argument. The sweetness warmed her belly, and to her own surprise, it made her eyes sting. Liska watched her quietly for a few spoonfuls, then said, "He meant it." Erisen paused. "The vow." "The vow," Liska agreed. "And the part where he didn't hand you over to a reeve with a sealed scroll." Her gaze sharpened. "Don't mistake that for the end of the trouble." "I don't," Erisen whispered. "Good." Liska's mouth tightened. "Ma will make noise. He'll accuse. He'll threaten." But the maze answered him with thorns in full daylight. She gave a short, satisfied huff. "That kind of witness is hard to bury." Erisen's pulse eased a fraction. "People saw," she murmured. "People always see," Liska said. "They just don't always understand what they saw." She leaned forward slightly, voice lowering. "That's why the next thing you do matters." Erisen swallowed. "The next thing?" Liska nodded toward the window, where thorn vine framed the glass like a living lattice. "Consistency," she said, echoing Sister Jorin's word. "If you soothe once and then vanish, starvation comes back." Her eyes narrowed. "So decide what you are, Erisen Vale. A traveler who happened to sing? Or a steward who stays because she chooses to?" Erisen's throat tightened. She had lived on the road so long that staying felt like stepping into a snare even when the door was open. "I'm afraid," she admitted, voice small. Liska's expression softened by a fraction. "Of being used," she said. Erisen nodded once, sharp. Liska sat back, the shawl slipping slightly on her shoulders. "Then make your terms," she said. Out loud. "Make them heard. A woman who names her boundaries is harder to turn into a tool." Erisen's breath shook. "And if he refuses?" Liska's eyes were steady. "Then he hasn't learned enough," she said. "And the maze will keep biting until he does." After Liska left, Erisen sat by the candle and stared at her hands, calloused, wrapped in faded cloth. She thought of the vow chamber, the saplight pulsing like a heartbeat, the way Soren's words had moved through the green as if the maze had been starving for sincerity more than for flesh. She thought of the moment in the courtyard when Soren had said her name as if it mattered. Not resource. Not witch. Not key. Erisen. By morning, the keep's chaos had shifted into a quieter, determined rhythm. Hedge wardens carried compost to the hedge line and spread it in careful rings. Buckets of spring water were poured at roots that had been scorched, and Sister Jorin stood nearby with a notebook, making brisk notes as if the hedge were a patient with a long illness. Nem Ashk worked until his arms shook, hauling damp cloth to smother smoldering bramble without hacking. His face was streaked with soot, but his eyes held a stubborn, fragile hope. Odrin Pell coordinated quietly, his voice firm but less harsh than before, as if he had learned that shouting did not make living things obey. When a hedge warden raised a pruning hook too eagerly, Odrin stopped him with a sharp glance and a quiet, careful. Not angry. The word angry felt new in his mouth, as if it applied to more than hedges. Soren spent the morning outside. Not behind the map table. Not sealed in the library with records. He walked the perimeter with his sleeves rolled up, carrying buckets until his hands reddened and sap smeared his fingers. He spoke to hedge wardens by name. He listened when they answered. He didn't fix everything with a single order, he asked questions he would have once considered weakness. Erisen watched from the inner steps, feeling something painful and tender tighten in her chest. He was trying. Not perfectly. Not gracefully. But earnestly, the way someone tries when they finally understand the price of not trying. Near midday, Sister Jorin approached Erisen with a folded parchment. "Records," Jorin said, and there was an approving glint in her eye. "Your voice woke more than the hedge. It woke memory. I found the old stewardship charter before it became hedge tithe and fear." Erisen took the parchment, fingers trembling slightly. The ink was faded, but the words were clear: paid wardens, offerings, boundaries, a promise to keep roads safe without turning green into punishment. "It existed," Erisen whispered. "It can exist again," Jorin said. "If he holds to it." Erisen's gaze drifted to Soren, who was helping Nem lift a soaked sack of compost. Soren's posture was stiff with effort, his jaw tight, but he didn't drop his end. He didn't bark at Nem to lift faster. He simply lifted. Jorin's voice lowered. "The maze answered his vow," she said. "But vows are not only for hedges. They are for people. What do you want, Erisen Vale?" Erisen swallowed. The question landed like Liska's had: simple, impossible. "I want to choose," she whispered. Jorin's eyes softened. "Then choose loudly," she said, and walked away, skirts brushing the stone. That afternoon, the keep's gate opened to villagers. Not all at once. Not in a rush. But in cautious clusters, women with baskets, men with calloused hands, children clinging to sleeves. They came to see whether Briarholt still stood and whether the hedge had calmed or only paused. They saw blossoms. Small pale flowers dotted the outer wall where the fire had licked. They were fragile, almost shy, and their presence made people whisper as if speaking too loudly might frighten them away. Odrin stood with arms crossed, watching the crowd like a guard dog, but he didn't chase them off. Nem hovered near the gate, scanning faces until he spotted a young woman in a patched cloak, his sister, eyes wide. He surged forward and pulled her into a fierce embrace. She laughed and cried at once, burying her face against his shoulder. Erisen's throat tightened at the sight. Soren stepped onto the courtyard steps, facing the gathered people. He looked tired, soot still in the lines of his hands, sleeplessness in his eyes, but his stance was steady. "I will speak plainly," he said, voice carrying. People fell quiet. "The Varricant was made to protect these marches," he continued. "My house treated it as a weapon and a prison. That ends now." A murmur rippled: disbelief, hope, skepticism. Soren lifted his chin slightly. "There will be no more hedge tithe," he said. "No more payment in blood or fear. Hedge wardens will be paid. Offerings will be made as stewardship, not bribes." He gestured toward Sister Jorin. "Law will be kept and followed." Eyes turned to Jorin, she inclined her head, solemn. Soren's gaze swept the crowd. "And any official who comes to claim a person as a resource will be denied," he said, voice hardening. Reeve Ma brought fire to a starving hedge. The hedge answered. "The realm can decide what it thinks of that." Whispers sharpened. Soren's eyes flicked to Erisen where she stood near the doorway. He didn't call her forward. He didn't present her like proof. He simply looked at her as if acknowledging she was the reason he could stand here and say these things. And then he did something that made the courtyard hold its breath. He stepped down the stairs and walked to her. The distance was only a few paces, but it felt like a crossing. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell smoke and soap on his skin. His voice lowered so only she could hear. "Say your terms," he murmured. Erisen's heart hammered. Liska's voice echoed in her mind, "Make them out loud." Erisen swallowed, throat still rough. She stepped forward half a pace, shoulders squared. She faced the crowd. The air tasted of damp stone and leaf shadow. Blossoms trembled on the hedge wall as if listening too. "My name is Erisen Vale," she said, voice hoarse but steady. "I am a singer. And I am a Thornsinger." A startled hush. She continued, forcing each word to be plain, unadorned. I will not be owned. Not by the crown. Not by a lord. Not by fear. She felt Soren's presence beside her, still and steady. I will help tend the Varricant, she said, because I choose to. Because people have bled enough. Because the hedge was made for sanctuary, and I won't let it starve into teeth again. Her breath shook. She steadied it. But I will stay only if my choice remains mine, she said. If I am treated as a person. If my voice is not demanded until it breaks. The silence was so deep Erisen could hear the faint rustle of leaves beyond the stone. Soren's voice rose, clear. Agreed, he said. Not as lord granting permission. As a man accepting terms. Erisen's chest tightened with something that was almost pain. Soren turned slightly toward the crowd. This is my vow as well, he said. Erisen Vale is not a tool of Briarholt. She is my partner in stewardship, if she will have it. Partner. The word sent a strange warmth through Erisen's ribs. She looked at him, surprised by the public honesty of it. His eyes held hers, intense and unguarded in a way that made her breath catch. Then, quieter, he said to her alone, will you? Erisen's throat tightened. For years, belonging had meant captivity. It had meant cages dressed as protection. But here stood a man who had offered his pride to a hungry hedge and then carried water until his arms trembled. A man who asked clumsily but asked nonetheless. Erisen inhaled slowly. Yes, she whispered, and the word felt like stepping through an open door instead of a locked gate. I will. A murmur spread through the crowd, not the sharp hiss of gossip, but a sound like cautious relief. Like hope people didn't quite trust yet. The hedge wall rustled. A few more blossoms unfurled as if answering. In the weeks that followed, change came not as a single grand moment but as a steady practice. Soren signed the old stewardship charter with new ink and new witnesses. Sister Jorin oversaw the hedge offerings with quiet authority. Odrin trained wardens to work without rage, to prune carefully, to sing low work chants that made the hedge lean away rather than bite. Nem's sister joined the steward's household as a runner, quick-footed and bright-eyed, and Nem's shoulders slowly unknotted as fear stopped living permanently in his muscles. Erisen's voice healed with rest and honey and patience. She learned the maze's moods the way one learns a person's, by watching what soothed it and what startled it. Some days it was calm enough to open corridors with a soft hum. Some days it was prickly and withdrawn, needing quiet offerings more than song. She did not treat it like a pet. She treated it like a wounded guardian trying to remember what it had been made to do. Soren learned too. He failed sometimes. His temper would flash, sharp as thorn. He would bark an order and then stop, jaw clenched, and try again, lower, steadier, with names and reasons instead of threats. Each time he corrected himself, Erisen felt something settle deeper between them, trust built on effort, not perfection. Their closeness grew in the seams of daily life. A hand offered to steady her over slick stones without grabbing. A cloak draped over her shoulders without being insisted upon. Late nights in the library where he read old hedge lore aloud, stumbling over unfamiliar phrases, and she laughed softly, not at him, but with him. Mornings where he brought her tea and then pretended it was for efficiency. They did not rush into declarations. They did not need to. Their love grew like the blossoms on the Varricant, slow, careful, fed by consistency. When the first true spring sun warmed the stones, Soren took Erisen to the hedge line at dawn. The maze stood tall, greener than it had been in years. Pale flowers dotted the outer wall like stars scattered through leaves. The air smelled of damp earth and something sweet and clean. Soren walked beside her without a guard in sight. His shoulders were still tense by nature, but the tension now looked like vigilance rather than control. He stopped beneath the iron arch and took a slow breath, as if gathering courage. Erisen's heart began to pound. What is it? She asked softly. Soren looked at her, and for a moment he seemed almost young, stripped of armor by sincerity. I can vow to a hedge, he said, voice rough. I can vow to my people. His jaw tightened. But you deserve a vow spoken to you, not only around you. Erisen's throat tightened. Soren's hand hovered, then offered itself, palm up. Not taking. Asking. Erisen placed her gloved fingers in his. His grip closed gently, warm and steady. "I won't pretend I'm good at this," he said, and the blunt honesty made her lips twitch. "I learned cruelty because it was easier than fear. I learned control because it felt like safety." His gaze held hers. "But you taught me gentleness is a choice, not a weakness." Erisen's eyes stung. Soren swallowed. "And you," he continued, "taught me that strength can be quiet. That it can sing." Erisen's breath shook. Soren's thumb brushed her knuckles, light, careful. "Erisen Vale," he said, voice low. "Will you marry me?" The words hung in the green air like a bell note. Erisen's heart hammered so hard it hurt. She had imagined weddings as traps for women like her, contracts written in someone else's hand. But this was a question asked with open palm. Choice offered. Erisen smiled, small and trembling. "Yes," she whispered. "If my choice stays mine." Soren's eyes softened. "Always," he said, and the certainty of it made her laugh softly through tears. The wedding was not extravagant. It was rooted. Liska Fen insisted on practicality, warm food, dry benches, enough lanterns that no one tripped and blamed the hedge. She also insisted on beauty in quiet places, weaving pale thornflowers into garlands and tying ribbons to the arch-scion with hands that still trembled slightly from her time in the maze. Odrin organized the hedge wardens into a respectful guard line, not in rigid ranks but in steady presence. "No one ruins this," he muttered, eyes sharp, though the corner of his mouth quirked as if he didn't know how to smile without looking suspicious. Nem stood beside his sister near the front, both of them scrubbed clean for once, their faces bright. Sister Jorin held the old stewardship charter rolled beneath her arm like a relic. Villagers came in their best patched clothes. Children carried baskets of petals gathered from safe hedgerows. The air smelled of bread and honey and crushed herbs. And the Varricant watched. Erisen wore a simple dress of pale green linen, belted with twine braided by hedge wardens who had once only known knots for binding and now learned knots for blessing. Her hair was woven with thorn flowers that did not scratch her scalp. The barbs had softened into gentle stems, as if the hedge itself understood. Soren wore dark wool with no crest at his throat. When Liska tried to pin a new emblem on him, he shook his head once. "Not today," he said quietly. They stood together at the iron arch where Erisen had first sung the seam open. The arch was framed now by living growth that no longer looked like a prison. Pale blossoms curled around the iron like a wreath. Leaves leaned inward, not threatening, but attentive like guests leaning closer to hear vows. Erisen's pulse hammered as she took her place. Soren's hand found hers, fingers warm, grip steady. He glanced at her once, and in his eyes she saw everything they had survived: smoke, hunger, fear, the moment in the hedgeheart when he had chosen sincerity over steel. Sister Jorin stepped forward and spoke words drawn from old pages and new truths, promises of care, boundaries, stewardship, partnership. Her voice was calm, anchoring. When it was time for vows, Soren spoke first. He did not attempt poetry. He looked at Erisen and said, voice rough, "I will listen. I will ask. I will not use your gift as a leash. I will not use fear as my language. When I fail, I will try again." Erisen's eyes stung. She answered, voice clear, healed enough now to carry resonance without pain. "I will stay by choice. I will speak truth even when it is uncomfortable. I will not hide my kindness as if it's shame. I will stand beside you in stewardship, and I will remind you, gently or sharply, when you forget." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the crowd at that, and even Soren's mouth twitched. Then Erisen did what she had dreamed of since she was a girl, hiding her gift behind ordinary songs. She sang. Not to command. Not to open a corridor. But to bless. A melody rose from her throat, steady and warm, woven with the resonance of vow. It wrapped the iron arch, the blossoms, the listening leaves, and the gathered people like a ribbon of light. The Varricant answered. Not with thorns. With bloom. Above them, the hedge growth shifted, slow, deliberate, and shaped itself into a full arch of flowers, pale and lush, curving over their heads like a bridal wreath. Petals loosened and drifted down, soft as snow. The crowd gasped. Children reached for falling blossoms, laughing. Erisen's breath caught at the sight, overwhelmed by the gentleness of it. She looked at Soren and found him staring upward too, his face bare with wonder. Then his gaze dropped to hers, intense and quiet. "Thank you," he murmured, so softly only she heard. Erisen smiled, tears shining. "Keep choosing," she whispered back. Soren's thumb brushed her knuckles. "Always." When they kissed, it was brief and tender, foreheads touching first, breath shared, a soft meeting that spoke of trust more than possession. The crowd cheered, and Liska Fen sniffed loudly as if dust had dared to attack her eyes. Afterward, there was bread and honey cakes, laughter warming the courtyard, and music that did not carry fear beneath it. Erisen played her lute, and this time her songs did not hide. They shone. Soren watched her from beside the long table, expression softer than anyone in Briarholt would have believed possible months before. As evening settled, the hedge wardens lit lanterns along the hedge line. The Varricant rustled, calm. Blossoms glimmered pale in lantern light. Erisen and Soren walked to the arch once the crowd began to thin, hands still linked, the quiet of twilight settling around them. Erisen rested her palm against the iron, feeling the faint vibration of the living green beyond. Not hungry. Not raging. Listening. Soren stood close, his shoulder brushing hers. "Do you think it will ever stop being afraid?" he asked quietly. Erisen leaned into him just enough to feel the steadiness of his warmth. "Maybe not entirely," she said. "But fear isn't a curse if you don't let it make you cruel." Soren's breath left him in a slow exhale. "You make it sound simple." Erisen's smile was small. "Not simple," she corrected. "Just possible." The hedge wall rustled softly, and a few petals drifted down between them like a blessing. Erisen lifted her face, breathed in the scent of green and honey and smoke fading into memory, and felt, finally, the strange, quiet safety of a home that did not require her to disappear. Beside her, Soren's hand tightened gently around hers, not as a chain, but as a promise kept.